When the most powerful duke in England asked a deaf woman to dance, the entire ballroom erupted in laughter. They called it humiliation. He called it war. Tonight, you'll witness a story of courage that shattered an empire's cruelty, where silence became the loudest weapon of all. A woman society dismissed as broken would rise to command the very world that mocked her. This is the story of Clara Whitford, the outcast who became a duchess, and the duke who saw strength where others saw only weakness. Stay until the end to see how she silenced them all. Drop a like and comment which city you're watching from. The chandeliers of Ashford Hall blazed like fallen stars, casting golden light across marble floors, polished to mirror perfection. 300 of England's finest had gathered for the season's most anticipated ball. Lords and ladies draped in silks worth more than most families earned in a lifetime, their laughter echoing off frescoed ceilings that had witnessed 2 centuries of aristocratic excess. Clara Whitford stood against the far wall, a shadow among the brilliance. 22 years old, with hair the color of autumn chestnuts pinned in fashionable curls, she couldn't hear being praised or mocked, wearing a gown of pale blue that her mother had selected without consulting her. The dress was beautiful, everyone said so, their lips moving in shapes Clara had learned to read. But beauty without voice was like gold without weight in this world. Decorative, meaningless. She watched the dancers swirl past, a kaleidoscope of movement that made her chest ache. The orchestra played somewhere beyond her reach, in that realm of sound that belonged to everyone else. She knew they were playing. She could see the musicians' arms moving, could feel the faintest vibration through the floor when the music swelled, but the melody existed in a dimension she would never enter. There's the Whitford girl. Lady Margaret's lips were easy to read. Clara had been watching them form cruel words for years. The older woman stood 15 feet away, her peacock-feathered fan fluttering as she leaned toward her companions. Such a pity. All that wealth utterly wasted. Can she even understand us? This from Lord Pemberton's wife, her expression a performance of exaggerated sympathy that made Clara's stomach turn. Who can say? The poor thing lives in her own little world. Clara's fingers tightened around her own fan, the ivory sticks pressing hard enough to hurt. She could walk away. She'd perfected the art of disappearing, of slipping through conversations and gatherings like smoke. But tonight, something kept her rooted. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was the realization that 22 years of being invisible had worn her down to nothing. I heard the Whitford family is desperate to marry her off, Lady Margaret continued, making no effort to lower her voice. Why would she? The deaf girl couldn't hear. 3 seasons now and not a single proposal, not even from the fortune hunters. Well, who would want damaged goods? Pemberton's wife laughed, the sound Clara couldn't hear but could see in the woman's shaking shoulders. Imagine the embarrassment. A wife who can't even respond when you speak to her? Like talking to furniture, Lord Pemberton added, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing servant. Pretty to look at, I suppose, but utterly useless in every way that matters. The words landed like stones, each one Clara caught and added to the collection she'd been gathering since childhood. She'd built walls from these stones, fortresses to protect whatever softness remained inside her. But walls could only grow so high before they became a prison. Across the room, her mother, Lady Catherine Whitford, held court among the older matrons, her smile brittle as spun sugar. Every few minutes, her gaze would dart toward Clara, a flash of something between concern and resignation. They'd had this argument 100 times, played out in furious gestures and written notes, because Catherine had never bothered to learn the hand signs Clara's governess had taught her. You must try harder, Clara. You must smile more. Be more agreeable. How can I be agreeable when I can't hear what anyone is saying? Then watch their faces. Anticipate. Adapt. This is your only chance at a decent future. But Clara had learned that decent future meant becoming someone's charity project, a noble sacrifice some second son might make to access the Whitford fortune. Love was for fairy stories, for people who could whisper sweet words in the darkness and hear them whispered back. She was about to retreat to the terrace, the one place she could breathe without feeling the weight of 300 judgments pressing down on her, when the ballroom shifted. She felt it before she understood it, a change in the air and the way people held themselves. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, fans froze mid-flutter. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance like flowers following the sun. Clara turned too. Duke Adrian Blackmore stood in the doorway, and even without hearing the sudden silence, Clara understood its meaning. Power had entered the room. She'd seen him before, of course. Everyone had. The Duke was impossible to miss. 6 feet of controlled authority in perfectly tailored black. His dark hair swept back from a face that could have been carved from granite for all the warmth it showed. 30 years old, worth a fortune that made even the Whitfords look modest, and infamous for his impossible standards. In 7 years since inheriting his title, he'd rejected every eligible woman in England. Princesses, heiresses, beauties celebrated in poetry, all dismissed with the same cool indifference that had earned him his reputation. The Ice Duke, they called him. The man who wanted nothing and no one. He moved into the ballroom with the confidence of someone who knew every eye was on him and cared nothing for it. His gaze swept the crowd, analytical, measuring. Clara watched him the way she watched everyone, carefully studying the micro-expressions that told truths voices never could. Most people looked at the Duke and saw cold perfection. Clara saw something else. She saw the way his jaw tightened when Lord Ashford rushed forward with obsequious greeting, the minute tension in his shoulders when the marriage-minded mothers positioned their daughters in his path like chess pieces. He was as trapped as she was, just in a different kind of prison. Their eyes met across the ballroom. Clara's breath caught. She'd been looked at her entire life, pitied, studied, dismissed. But Adrian Blackmore didn't look at her the way others did. His gaze held no pity, no curiosity about her defect. He looked at her the way a general might study terrain before a battle, assessing, calculating. And then, impossibly, he started walking toward her. The crowd parted like water. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This couldn't be happening. Dukes didn't approach wallflowers. They certainly didn't approach the deaf wallflower everyone pitied and no one wanted. But he kept coming. Lady Margaret's mouth fell open. Pemberton's wife gripped her husband's arm. Clara's mother rose from her seat, one hand pressed to her throat. Adrian stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Clara could see the exact shade of his eyes, gray like storm clouds over the Thames, close enough to be undeniably intentional. The entire ballroom held its breath. He extended his hand, palm up, an invitation. Clara stared at that outstretched hand like it might be a weapon. Around them, she could see the reactions rippling outward. Shock, confusion, the beginning of cruel laughter at the edges of the crowd. He's mocking you, her mind whispered. This is some kind of test or joke. The Ice Duke, asking the deaf girl to dance? But when she looked up at his face, she saw no mockery there, only patience, and something else she couldn't quite name. No. She spoke aloud, the word shaped carefully, the way her governess had taught her. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, disconnected from her body. She hated speaking, hated not knowing if the words came out right, if she sounded as broken as everyone believed. Adrian's expression didn't change. He kept his hand extended, waiting. I can't, Clara continued, her voice barely above a whisper. She gestured vaguely toward her ear, toward her whole self, all the reasons why this was impossible. I can't hear the music. I can't. He took another step closer, close enough now that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, close enough that she could smell expensive cologne and something else, something distinctly him. Then Adrian Blackmore did something no one expected. He raised his free hand and tapped his chest over his heart. Once, twice, 3 times, a steady rhythm. Clara's eyes widened. She understood. Feel, he was telling her. Not hear. Feel. Around them, the whispers were building. She could see them spreading like wildfire. Lady Margaret looked scandalized. Pemberton was laughing. Clara's mother had gone pale. This is your chance, something inside her whispered. To be seen. To be real. Even if just for one dance. Or, another part of her answered, this is how you become the biggest joke in London society. The deaf girl who thought a duke actually wanted to dance with her. Adrian's hand remained steady. His eyes never left hers. And in that gaze, Clara saw something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Choice. He was giving her a choice. Not pity, not obligation, pure, simple choice. Her hand trembled as she raised it. She could feel every eye in the ballroom burning into her skin. could see her mother's face, white with horror or hope, she couldn't tell which, could see the smirks and the gasps and the beginning of what would either be her greatest triumph or her final humiliation. Clara placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm, steady, strong. Not the careful grip of someone handling something fragile, but the firm clasp of someone who expected strength in return. Adrian led her onto the dance floor. The crowd pressed in around them, a wall of judgment and curiosity. Claire could see musicians in the corner, their bows moving across violin strings. She could see the conductor's arms rising and falling, but the music remained locked away in that place she couldn't reach. Panic fluttered in her chest. How was she supposed to do this? She'd spent her entire life avoiding dancing because what was the point? She'd just stumble and misstep and prove everyone right about how useless she was. Then Adrian's hand settled on her waist, and the world shifted. His touch was firm, commanding but not controlling. His other hand held hers at shoulder height, and through those 2 points of contact, Clara felt it, the rhythm. Not the music itself, she would never have that, but through his body, through the subtle shifts in his weight, and the gentle pressure of his hands, she could feel the beat, the pattern, the structure that held the dance together. He began to move, and Clara moved with him. It wasn't graceful at first. She stumbled over her own feet, stepped on his toes, felt the heat of embarrassment flood her face. But Adrian didn't flinch, didn't grimace or pull away. He simply adjusted, his grip tightening just slightly, guiding her back into the rhythm. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. She could feel it now, pulsing through his frame into hers, could anticipate his movements by reading the tension in his shoulders, the shift of his weight. This was a language she understood. Not words, but bodies. Not sound, but sensation. Around them, the laughter was growing. Clara could see it in her peripheral vision, could see the way people pointed and whispered and shook their heads. Lord Pemberton made some joke that had his companions roaring. Lady Margaret looked like she might faint from the scandal of it all. Let them laugh. For the first time in her 22 years, Clara Whitford wasn't invisible. She wasn't being pitied or dismissed or talked around like a piece of furniture that couldn't understand. She was being seen, truly seen, by someone who looked at her and found her worthy. The dance continued. With each turn, each step, Clara felt something inside her uncoiling, some tight knot of shame and resignation she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. Adrian's eyes never left her face, steady and sure, and she realized he was reading her just as carefully as she was reading him. When her foot slipped on a particularly complex turn, his hand tightened on her waist, holding her steady. When she second-guessed herself and hesitated, he waited, patient as stone, until she found the rhythm again. They weren't just dancing, they were communicating in a way that transcended words, transcended sound. In a ballroom full of people who could hear perfectly and understand nothing, Clara and Adrian had found a language only they spoke. The music, that invisible force she could never quite grasp, began to slow. Clara felt it in the gentling of Adrian's movements, the gradual stilling of his frame. The dance was ending. Reality crashed back like a wave. They stood in the center of the ballroom, still holding each other, while 300 aristocrats stared at them with expressions ranging from shock to disgust to poorly concealed glee at the scandal unfolding before them. Adrian released her waist but kept hold of her hand. He raised it to his lips, a gesture so old-fashioned and formal that it silenced even the cruelest whispers, and pressed a kiss to her knuckles that Clara felt like a brand. Then he looked directly into her eyes and spoke. Clara couldn't hear the words, but she could read his lips with perfect clarity. Thank you. Not, you did well for someone like you. Not, that was brave considering your limitations. Just, thank you. As if she had given him something precious. As if this dance had mattered. He released her hand and stepped back. The crowd immediately surged forward, questions and exclamations written on every face. But Adrian cut through them like a knife through silk, his expression returning to that mask of ice that kept the world at arm's length. Clara stood alone in the center of the dance floor, her heart racing, her whole body trembling with the aftershocks of what had just happened. Her mother appeared at her elbow, fingers digging into Clara's arm hard enough to bruise. Catherine's face was a war between fury and calculation, her lips moving rapidly. What were you thinking? Do you have any idea what you've just done? The scandal! But Clara wasn't listening, wasn't watching her mother's lips form accusations and concerns. She was watching Adrian Blackmore as he made his way to the terrace doors, watching the way people parted before him, watching the way he moved through the world like he owned it. Just before he reached the doors, he turned. His eyes found hers across the crowded ballroom, across the sea of aristocratic judgment and scandal. And for just a moment, so brief Clara almost thought she'd imagined it, one corner of his mouth lifted. Not a smile exactly, but something close. Something that made Clara's breath catch and her pulse race. Then he was gone, disappeared into the night like he'd never been there at all. But he had been, and nothing would ever be the same. "Clara!" Her mother's hand shook her arm, demanding attention. "Clara, look at me!" Clara turned to face Lady Catherine, saw the mixture of horror and hope warring on her mother's face. Around them, the whispers were building to a roar Clara couldn't hear but could feel in the very air. The Duke danced with her. Adrian Blackmore danced with the deaf girl. What does it mean? Is he mocking her? Mocking us all? Or is he... No one dared finish that thought, because the idea that the Ice Duke, the man who had rejected princesses and heiresses and the most beautiful women in England, might have genuine interest in Clara Whitford was too absurd to even consider. Wasn't it? Lady Margaret descended on them like a bird of prey, her fan snapping open and closed with agitation. Her lips moved rapidly. "Catherine, dear, you must control your daughter. This display was absolutely magnificent." The word came from behind them, spoken by Lord Ashford himself, the host of the evening. He was an older man, one of the few who had always been kind to Clara in his distracted way. His face was flushed with excitement as he looked at her. "My dear Miss Whitford, that was the most talked-about dance of the season, perhaps of the decade. The Duke himself, asking you—" He gestured expansively, searching for words adequate to the moment. Lady Margaret's expression soured. "Really, Ashford, there's no need to encourage—" "The Duke has never asked anyone to dance," Ashford continued, ignoring her completely. "Not once in all the years since his father died. Not at any ball, any gathering, any event. He's turned down princesses, Lady Margaret, actual princesses. And tonight, he chose Miss Whitford." The weight of that statement settled over the group like snow. Clara watched comprehension dawn on various faces, some excited, some calculating, some resentful. Her mother's grip on her arm shifted from restraining to possessive. "Of course," Catherine said carefully, her voice taking on a tone Clara recognized from years of practice, pride barely masking panic. "Clara has always been exceptional, in her own way." Translation: Please don't let this be a cruel joke. Please let this mean something. But Clara barely heard the conversation unfolding around her. Her mind was still on the terrace, still following Adrian Blackmore into the darkness, still trying to understand what had just happened. He hadn't treated her like a curiosity or a charity case, hadn't danced with her the way one might dance with a child or an invalid, careful, patronizing, performance of kindness masking contempt. He had danced with her like she was an equal, like she was worthy. The thought was so foreign, so completely outside Clara's experience, that she didn't know what to do with it. She'd built her entire identity around being less than, the broken daughter, the disappointing heir, the girl who would never quite measure up because she was missing something fundamental. But for those few minutes on the dance floor, she hadn't been missing anything. She had been enough exactly as she was. "Clara!" Her mother's hand on her arm again, gentler this time. When Clara focused on Catherine's face, she saw something she'd rarely witnessed there, genuine concern. "Are you all right?" The question was so unexpected that Clara laughed, a sound she only half controlled, too loud in her own head. Her mother flinched slightly, and Clara felt the familiar shame creep back in. Even her laughter was wrong, too unmodulated, too strange. But then she remembered the way Adrian had looked at her, not flinching, not pitying, just seeing. "Yes," Clara said, shaping the word carefully. "I'm all right." More than all right. For the first time in her life, she was awake. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. People who had ignored Clara for 3 seasons suddenly wanted to speak with her, their faces bright with curiosity or malice or calculation. She read their lips, answered their questions with the careful politeness her governess had drilled into her, and felt like she was watching it all happen to someone else. "Did the Duke say anything to you? How did you know when to move? Is it true you've met him before? Do you think he'll ask again?" That last question, whispered by a young woman whose name Clara couldn't remember, made her pause. Would he ask again? Or had this been a single moment of madness, never to be repeated? She didn't know. Couldn't know. But as her mother finally steered her toward the carriages, as they prepared to leave Ashford Hall behind, Clara caught herself doing something she hadn't done in years, hoping. The carriage ride home was silent, or at least silent for Clara. Her mother sat across from her in the dim interior, her face periodically illuminated by street lamps as they rattled through London's dark streets. Catherine's lips moved occasionally, forming words Clara didn't bother to read. Questions or complaints or plans, it didn't matter. Clara's hand still tingled where Adrian had kissed it. Her waist still felt the ghost of his touch. And deep in her chest, beneath the layers of protection she'd built up over 22 years, something dangerous was stirring. Permission. Permission to want more than shadows and pity. Permission to believe she might deserve something real. When they finally arrived at Whitford House, Clara went straight to her chambers, waving off her lady's maid's attempts to help her undress. She wanted to be alone with this feeling, this strange new lightness that had taken root inside her. She stood at her window, looking out over the sleeping city, and let herself remember every detail. The way Adrian had moved, the steadiness of his hand, the moment when their eyes met and she'd understood, really understood, that he wasn't mocking her, he was inviting her. To what? She didn't know. But standing there in the darkness, still wearing her pale blue gown, still feeling the phantom rhythm of a dance she couldn't hear, Clara Whitford made herself a promise. Whatever happened next, whether Adrian Blackmore disappeared back into his ice palace and never looked at her again, whether this became London's favorite scandal to laugh about over tea, whether her mother's hopes or Lady Margaret's predictions came true, Clara would remember this night. She would remember what it felt like to be seen, and she would never, ever let herself become invisible again. Outside her window, London slept. But somewhere in that sleeping city, a duke stood on his own terrace, looking out at the same stars, thinking about a woman in a pale blue dress who had trembled in his arms and danced anyway. The game had begun. Neither of them knew the rules yet, but both of them understood that everything had changed. The morning after the ball, Clara woke to find London had already decided her fate. She knew something was wrong the moment her lady's maid entered with the breakfast tray. Emily's face was carefully neutral, too neutral, and she wouldn't meet Clara's eyes as she set down the silver service and drew back the curtains. Clara sat up, her body still aching pleasantly from muscles unused to dancing. The memory of last night wrapped around her like warmth, but Emily's strange behavior sent ice trickling down her spine. She gestured sharply, demanding Emily's attention. When the maid finally looked at her, Clara signed, "What's happened?" Emily's hands trembled as she signed back, clumsily, because she'd only learned the basics. "Your mother wants to see you, immediately. She's upset." That could mean anything. Catherine Whitford was perpetually upset about something Clara had done or failed to do. But there was something in Emily's expression that suggested this was different. Clara dressed quickly, choosing a simple morning dress of lavender muslin, and made her way downstairs. The house felt strange, charged with an energy she couldn't quite identify. Servants whispered in corners and fell silent when she passed. Even old Mr. Peters, the butler who'd known her since childhood, looked at her with something between pity and fascination. She found her mother in the morning room, surrounded by what appeared to be every newspaper in London. Catherine's face was pale, her hands shaking as she held a piece of paper covered in her own frantic handwriting. The moment she saw Clara, she stood, her lips already forming words. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Clara's stomach dropped. She'd expected consequences. Gossip, certainly, perhaps some increased scrutiny. But the look on her mother's face suggested something far worse. Catherine thrust one of the newspapers at her. Clara took it, her eyes scanning the page until they landed on the society column. "The Ice Duke melts for the mute Miss Whitford." Last night at Ashford Hall, London society witnessed an event that will be discussed for years to come. Duke Adrian Blackmore, known for his cold rejection of every eligible lady in England, asked Miss Clara Whitford, the deaf daughter of Lord and Lady Whitford, to dance. The sight of the Duke leading the unfortunate girl around the ballroom has sparked fierce debate among the aristocracy. Is this an act of charity, a cruel joke, or has the impossible happened? Has the Ice Duke finally found someone worthy of his attention? Miss Whitford, who has spent 3 seasons failing to secure any offers of marriage, appeared shocked by the Duke's request. Sources report she initially refused, no doubt aware of her limitations on the dance floor. But the Duke persisted, and the resulting spectacle was, by all accounts, both touching and troubling. While some praised the Duke's kindness toward the less fortunate, others questioned whether such public attention might give the Whitford family false hope. One thing is certain. Society will be watching closely to see if this was a single gesture of pity or something more scandalous. Clara's hands tightened on the paper, crumpling the edges. The words blurred together. Unfortunate girl, limitations, less fortunate, false hope. They'd taken something beautiful and made it ugly. There are 6 more just like it, Catherine said, her voice sharp enough that Clara could read the anger vibrating through her entire frame. The Times is slightly more diplomatic, but the Morning Post outright calls you a charity case. The scandal sheets are worse. They're speculating that the Duke was drunk or making a wager. Clara set down the paper carefully, fighting to keep her hands steady. She'd known there would be talk, but she hadn't expected this. This systematic dismantling of the one moment in her life when she'd felt seen rather than pitied. Lady Margaret sent a note this morning, Catherine continued, pacing now, her morning dress swishing with each agitated step. She's calling an emergency gathering of the patronesses. They want to discuss whether your display last night constitutes behavior unbecoming of a lady of quality. Display. As if Clara had done something vulgar rather than simply accepting an invitation to dance. And your father, Catherine's voice cracked. She pressed her fingers to her temples. Your father received 3 letters before breakfast. 3 separate gentlemen, all withdrawing their interest in you. Not that any of them had shown real interest, but they'd been possibilities, Clara. Slim possibilities, but possibilities nonetheless. Clara felt something cold and hard settling in her chest. Of course this was what mattered. Not that she'd been brave. Not that she'd stepped onto that dance floor despite her terror. Not that for one perfect moment she'd been more than the broken Whitford daughter. All that mattered was that she'd damaged her already minimal value on the marriage market. She signed slowly, making sure her mother was watching. I didn't ask him to dance with me. No, Catherine agreed, her expression softening slightly. No, you didn't, but you accepted. Clara, you had to have known what would happen. The Duke he's untouchable, unreachable. When someone like that shows attention to someone like... She trailed off, but Clara could fill in the rest. Someone like you, someone damaged, someone less. What were you thinking? Catherine's hands gripped Clara's shoulders, forcing eye contact. Did you think he was serious? Did you imagine that that Duke could possibly want anything real with you? The words landed like blows, each one carefully aimed at the soft parts Clara had been foolish enough to leave unguarded. Because she had thought that, hadn't she? For one dangerous moment last night, she'd let herself believe that Adrian Blackmore had looked at her and seen something worthy. But London had woken up this morning with a different story, and London's story was the only one that mattered. Clara pulled away from her mother's grip and signed, "What do you want me to do?" Catherine's face crumpled. For a moment, she looked every one of her 45 years, all the fight draining out of her. "I don't know," she said quietly. "For once in my life, I genuinely don't know." The door burst open. Clara's father, Lord Reginald Whitford, strode in with a fury she'd rarely seen in the man who usually preferred his study and his port to family drama. His face was red, his collar askew, and he held a letter in his hand like a weapon. "Catherine," he said, his voice carrying the boom that Clara felt rather than heard. "We need to talk. Now. Clara, out." Clara hesitated, but her mother nodded sharply. She fled to the hallway, closing the door behind her, but positioned herself where she could see through the gap. Her father was shouting. She could see it in the way his whole body shook, the veins standing out on his neck. Her mother sat down heavily, her face going from pale to gray. Whatever was in that letter, it was bad. Clara pressed herself against the wall, trying to read her father's lips through the narrow opening, catching fragments. Completely humiliated. Laughingstock. That Duke has made fools of us all. So it was official then. Last night hadn't been a beginning. It had been an ending. The final nail in the coffin of any hopes Clara might have harbored for a normal life. She should have known better. Should have stayed against the wall where she belonged, invisible and safe. The door opened suddenly, and Clara stumbled back. Her father stood in the doorway, his anger spent, replaced by something colder. Disappointment. "You're to stay home for the next week," he said, speaking slowly and clearly so she could read his lips. "No visiting, no calls, no appearing in public until this scandal dies down. Do you understand?" Clara nodded. What else could she do? "And when people ask about the Duke, you're to make it clear that you have no expectations, none whatsoever. It was a moment of kindness from a great man, nothing more. Are we clear?" Another nod. Her throat felt too tight to attempt words. Her father sighed, some of the rigidity leaving his shoulders. "You're a good girl, Clara, but you're not. This world isn't built for you. The sooner you accept that, the easier everything becomes." He left. Clara stood in the hallway, her father's words echoing in the space where sound should be. This world isn't built for you. She'd known that, of course, had known it every day of her 22 years. But somehow, hearing it said so plainly, so finally, made it real in a way it had never been before. The week of isolation that followed was its own special kind of torture. Clara spent her days in her room or the garden, avoiding the pitying looks of servants and the disappointed sighs of her parents. Emily brought her meals and the daily papers, because even though Clara had been forbidden from appearing in public, she couldn't escape the public's fascination with her humiliation. The stories evolved day by day. By Wednesday, the consensus seemed to be that the Duke had danced with her as part of some elaborate social experiment. By Friday, rumors suggested he'd been testing the limits of his own influence, proving he could make even the most ridiculous pairing seem acceptable through sheer force of will. Each story was more demeaning than the last, but they all shared one common thread. Adrian Blackmore had moved on, had already forgotten about the deaf girl he'd briefly noticed at a ball. Life had returned to normal for him. Only Clara remained stuck, pinned like a butterfly to a board, subject to endless examination and discussion. On the 8th day, when her father finally lifted the restriction on leaving the house, Clara felt no relief. Where would she go? Who would want to see her? She'd become London's favorite cautionary tale, the girl who'd reached too high and learned her place. But her mother had other plans. "You're coming to Lady Pemberton's garden party this afternoon," Catherine announced over breakfast, her tone brooking no argument. Clara's hand stilled on her teacup. She signed, "Why?" "Because hiding only makes things worse. Because we need to show society that we're not ashamed, that we understand last week was nothing more than a kind gesture from the Duke, and that we're moving forward with grace." Translation: because we need to do damage control before the scandal completely destroys us. Clara wanted to refuse, wanted to stay in her room, where at least she was safe from the stares and whispers and thinly veiled mockery. But she'd spent her whole life doing what was expected, being good, trying not to cause trouble. One dance hadn't changed that. Lady Pemberton's garden party was exactly as horrific as Clara had anticipated. The moment she and her mother arrived, conversation stopped. Every head turned. The whispers began immediately, spreading like ripples in a pond. "That's her. Can you believe? Poor thing. I heard the Duke hasn't mentioned her once since—" Clara kept her chin up, her expression carefully neutral, as her mother guided her through the crowd. They'd discuss the strategy on the carriage ride over, smile politely, accept sympathies graciously, make it clear that Clara had no delusions about the Duke's attention. Be small, be apologetic, disappear back into the shadows where she belonged. Lady Margaret descended on them like a hawk, her smile sharp as knives. "Catherine! Clara! How brave of you to come!" Brave. As if attending a garden party required courage. As if Clara were a soldier heading into battle rather than a woman trying to survive her own society. "We wouldn't miss it," Catherine replied smoothly, her hand tight on Clara's arm. Clara has been quite eager to thank everyone for their concern regarding last week's events. Clara forced herself to smile and nod, playing the part of the grateful invalid who knew her place. Of course, Lady Margaret said, her eyes gleaming. We've all been so worried. Such an unusual situation, though I'm sure the Duke meant well in his own way. Meant well. As if he'd been doing charity work rather than asking a woman to dance. Tell me, Lady Margaret continued, turning her attention fully to Clara and speaking with exaggerated slowness, as if volume might somehow help Clara hear. Have you heard from His Grace since the ball? The question was a trap, and everyone within earshot knew it. Clara could see the other guests leaning in, eager to hear her answer. If she said yes, she'd be accused of delusion or lying. If she said no, it proved she'd been nothing more than a momentary whim. Clara shook her head. I see. Lady Margaret's expression managed to convey both sympathy and satisfaction. Well, I'm sure he's been very busy. Men of his stature have such demands on their time. Indeed, said a new voice, smooth as silk and cold as winter. I can barely find a moment to myself. Every head whipped around. Adrian Blackmore stood at the edge of the terrace, immaculate in a dark blue coat, his gray eyes taking in the scene with that same analytical precision Clara remembered. He looked completely at ease, as if he attended garden parties every day rather than avoiding social events for years. Lady Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Your Grace, we had no idea. That is, we weren't expecting. I'm sure you weren't. Adrian's gaze swept past her dismissively and landed on Clara. Miss Whitford, how fortunate to find you here. The garden had gone completely silent. Clara could feel her mother's hand tightening on her arm, could see the shock rippling through the assembled guests. Adrian Blackmore had not only appeared at a social event, he'd appeared and immediately sought out Clara. He crossed the terrace with that same predatory grace she remembered, the crowd partying before him like the Red Sea. When he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, Clara forgot how to breathe. I've been meaning to call on you, he said, speaking directly to her, ignoring everyone else completely. But I thought perhaps a more public setting would be appropriate, given the conversation our last encounter seems to have generated. His words were perfectly calculated, perfectly chosen. Not, I meant to visit but forgot. Not, I've been busy. But I've been meaning to call on you, implying intention, continuity, interest, and conversation. What a delicate way to describe the feeding frenzy of gossip and speculation. Clara found her voice, shaped the words carefully. You didn't need to come. No, Adrian agreed. I wanted to. Lady Margaret made a strangled sound. Catherine's grip on Clara's arm had become painful. Adrian turned to Lady Pemberton, who stood frozen near the refreshment table. Lady Pemberton, I hope you don't mind if I steal Miss Whitford for a walk through your excellent gardens. I've heard so much about your roses. Of course, Your Grace, you're most welcome to... Lady Pemberton was practically stammering. Adrian offered his arm to Clara. It was the same gesture as the dance, a choice, an invitation. He could have simply announced his intention and expected her to follow. Instead, he waited, giving her the power to refuse. Clara looked at her mother, who nodded frantically, looked at Lady Margaret, whose face had gone purple, looked at the dozens of guests who were watching the scene unfold with expressions ranging from shock to delight to fury. Then she placed her hand on Adrian's arm and let him lead her away from the terrace, down the stone steps, into the manicured gardens where the scent of roses hung heavy in the afternoon air. They walked in silence for a full minute, moving deeper into the garden until the guests on the terrace became distant figures. Claire's heart hammered against her ribs. She had 1,000 questions, but her voice felt trapped in her throat. Finally, Adrian stopped beside a fountain. The water caught the sunlight, sending fractured rainbows dancing through the spray. He turned to face her, his expression serious. I need to apologize, he said. Clara blinked. Of all the things she'd expected, that wasn't one of them. I didn't anticipate the severity of the response to our dance, Adrian continued. I should have. I know how society works, how cruel it can be to anyone who steps outside the prescribed boundaries. I put you in an impossible position, and for that, I'm sorry. Clara stared at him, trying to reconcile this with everything she'd been told about the Ice Duke. This wasn't cold or calculating. This was genuine. It's not your fault, she managed, her voice shakier than she wanted. Isn't it? Adrian's mouth twisted slightly. I knew what would happen when I asked you to dance. I knew they'd talk, that they'd speculate and gossip and make you into a spectacle. I did it anyway. Why? The question slipped out before Clara could stop it. It was the question she'd been asking herself for 8 days. Why her? Why that night? Why risk his reputation and hers for a single dance? Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fountain. When he finally looked at her, there was something raw in his eyes that made Clara's breath catch. Because I'm tired, he said simply. Tired of the performance, tired of pretending that any of them. He gestured vaguely back toward the terrace, encompassing all of society, matter. Tired of watching people preen and pose and present carefully constructed versions of themselves while hiding everything real. He took a step closer. And then I saw you, standing against the wall, watching everything with those eyes that see too much. Not performing, not pretending, just existing, being real in a room full of lies. Clara felt tears prickling behind her eyes. They all think you were mocking me. I know. They think it was charity, or a joke, or... I know, Adrian repeated, and I'm here to make it clear that they're wrong. He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope, cream-colored and sealed with the Blackmore crest. He held it out to Clara. This is an invitation, he said, to a ball I'm hosting at Blackmore House 2 weeks from tonight. I'm inviting you personally, directly, in front of as many witnesses as possible. Clara took the envelope with trembling hands. You're hosting a ball? My first in 7 years. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I thought it was time. Adrian. She caught herself, heat flooding her face. Your Grace, I mean... Adrian is fine, when we're alone at least. He paused. Will you come? To the ball? It was the same question as before, just in different words. The same choice. The same risk. But this time Clara understood what she'd be choosing. This wasn't just a dance, this was a declaration. If she accepted this invitation, if she showed up at Blackmore House as his personal guest, she'd be stepping into the center of the storm. Society would be watching, judging, tearing her apart with every glance, every whisper, every carefully constructed rumor. Her parents would be terrified. The scandal would intensify. She'd become even more of a spectacle, even more of a cautionary tale. But she'd also be seen, really, truly seen, by someone who looked at her and found her worthy exactly as she was. Claire met Adrian's eyes and found her answer in the steady gray depths. Yes, she said, I'll come. The smile that crossed Adrian's face was small, barely there, but genuine. Good. They began walking back toward the terrace, where Clara could see the assembled guests straining to watch them, to catch any hint of what had transpired in the garden. They're going to make this impossible for you, Adrian said quietly. When they realize I'm serious, they'll do everything they can to undermine you, to prove you're not worthy of my attention. I know. It will be worse than the last week, much worse. Clara thought about her father's words. This world isn't built for you. Thought about Lady Margaret's thinly veiled contempt. Thought about the newspaper articles dissecting her every flaw. Then she thought about the dance, about being held steady while the world spun, about the moment when she'd stopped being invisible. I know, she repeated. I don't care. Adrian stopped walking. When Clara turned to look at him, she found something fierce in his expression, something that made her pulse race. Neither do I, he said. They emerged from the garden onto the terrace, where the entire party waited with barely concealed anticipation. Adrian made no move to release Clara's arm, no attempt to create distance or propriety. Instead, he led her directly to Lady Margaret. Lady Margaret, he said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence, I trust you'll make sure everyone knows. Miss Whitford will be attending my ball as my personal guest. I expect her to be treated with the utmost respect. It wasn't a request. It was a command from a duke to his social inferiors. Lady Margaret's face went through several interesting colors before settling on a sickly smile. Of course, Your Grace. We wouldn't dream of— Wouldn't you? Adrian's gaze swept the terrace, landing on each guest in turn. Because I've heard some of the things being said about Miss Whitford this past week. Some of the speculation and gossip. I found it disappointing. The word landed like a stone in still water. Disappointing. From a duke, it was the worst possible indictment. If I hear anything similar after today, Adrian continued, his tone pleasant, but his eyes cold as winter, I'll know exactly who to hold responsible. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Cross Adrian Blackmore and find yourself on the outside of society. It was a power play, ruthless and effective. And he was doing it for her. Clara felt something dangerous taking root in her chest, something that felt suspiciously like hope. Adrian turned to her, his expression softening slightly. I should go, but I'll send the formal invitation by tomorrow. And Clara— He lowered his voice so only she could hear. Don't let them make you small. You're not built for shadows. Then he was gone, striding away through the stunned crowd, leaving Clara standing on the terrace with her mother's hand clutching her arm and 50 pairs of eyes boring into her. The whispers started immediately, but they were different now. Uncertain, recalculating. Because Adrian Blackmore didn't make threats lightly, and he just made it clear that Clara Whitford was under his protection. Lady Margaret recovered first, her smile brittle. Well, she said loudly, how unexpected. Catherine squeezed Clara's arm. Excitement or warning, it was hard to tell. We should be going, she said. Clara needs to rest after such an eventful afternoon. They made their escape, but Clara could feel every eye following them. Could see the new calculations being made, the social mathematics being reconfigured. She was no longer just the deaf daughter of the Whitfords, the charity case, the cautionary tale. She was the woman who had somehow, impossibly, captured the attention of the Ice Duke, and that made her dangerous. In the carriage, her mother was practically vibrating with suppressed emotion. Her lips moved rapidly. Clara, do you understand what just happened? The Duke, at a public event, defending you, issuing threats on your behalf. This is unprecedented, absolutely unprecedented. Clara nodded, still processing it all herself. We need to be careful, Catherine continued, her excitement giving way to anxiety. This could still go very wrong. If he changes his mind, if this is some kind of elaborate game— It's not a game, Clara interrupted, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. Her mother looked at her sharply. How can you possibly know that? Because she'd seen his eyes when he apologized, had heard the weariness in his voice when he talked about being tired of performance, had felt the steadiness of his hand, the deliberate choice in every action. But she couldn't explain that to her mother, so instead she signed, I just know. Catherine sat back, studying Clara's face with an expression that was part concern, part wonder. You've changed, she said quietly, since the ball. You're different. Clara met her mother's gaze. Yes, she signed, I am. The question was whether London was ready for who she was becoming. Clara discovered the answer 2 days later, and it came wrapped in venom. She was in the drawing room when Emily brought the first letter. The maid's face was ashen as she handed over the cream envelope, unmarked except for Clara's name written in sharp, angry strokes. Clara broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The words inside were brief. Stay away from the Duke. You don't belong in his world. This is your only warning. No signature. No explanation needed. Clara's hands didn't shake as she set the letter aside. She'd expected this. Adrian had warned her, and she'd chosen to proceed anyway. Anonymous threats were just another form of whispering, and she'd survived whispers her entire life. But the second letter arrived that afternoon, then a third the next morning. By the end of the week, Clara had received 11 letters, each one more vicious than the last. Crippled wretch. Do you really think a duke could want damaged goods? You're embarrassing yourself and your family. Have some dignity. He's playing with you. When he's done, you'll be ruined. Clara kept them all in a drawer in her writing desk, each one a small monument to how much her visibility had cost. She showed them to no one, not her mother, not Emily, certainly not Adrian. What would be the point? The letters changed nothing. She'd already made her choice. But the letters were only the beginning. 3 days before Adrian's ball, Clara and her mother attended a small musicale at the home of Mrs. Beatrice Ashworth, a wealthy widow known for her patronage of young musicians. It should have been safe, an intimate gathering of perhaps 40 guests, mostly older ladies and their daughters, all supposedly civilized. Clara should have known better. The performance was already underway when they arrived, a young pianist playing something Clara couldn't hear but could feel vibrating through the floor. She and Catherine slipped into seats near the back, trying to be unobtrusive. Lady Margaret sat 3 rows ahead. Clara watched her lean toward Mrs. Ashworth, saw her lips moving rapidly. Both women turned to look at Clara, their expressions calculating. The music ended. Polite applause rippled through the room. Mrs. Ashworth stood, her smile bright and false. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her lips easy to read. "Before our next performance, I thought we might have a small discussion about propriety." The word hung in the air like a blade. "As you all know," Mrs. Ashworth continued, "our society is built on certain standards, traditions that have served us well for generations. One of those traditions is that young ladies must conduct themselves with the utmost discretion, especially when it comes to matters of courtship." Clara's stomach dropped. Catherine's hand found hers squeezing tight enough to hurt. "It has come to my attention," Mrs. Ashworth said, her gaze landing directly on Clara, "that some young ladies have been overreaching, pursuing connections far above their station, causing scandal and embarrassment for everyone involved." Several women nodded. Clara saw agreement rippling through the crowd like a wave. "We've all heard the rumors about the Duke of Blackmore and his unfortunate charitable gesture toward Miss Whitford." Mrs. Ashworth's smile sharpened. "I'm sure the young lady meant well, but accepting such attention, encouraging it even, shows a shocking lack of judgment." "Now really," Catherine began, but Mrs. Ashworth spoke over her. "A truly gracious young lady would recognize when a gentleman is simply being kind. She wouldn't mistake politeness for genuine interest. She wouldn't chase after a man so clearly out of her reach, making a spectacle of herself and dragging his good name through the mud." The attack was surgical. Every word chosen to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. Mrs. Ashworth wasn't naming Clara directly, but everyone in the room knew exactly who she meant. Clara felt heat flooding her face. Around her she could see the reactions, some sympathetic, some gleeful, all watching to see what she would do, how the deaf girl would respond to an attack she might not even fully understand. But Clara understood perfectly. She'd been reading lips and micro-expressions her entire life. She knew exactly what was happening. This was a test, a public humiliation designed to put her back in her place, to remind her that no matter what Adrian Blackmore said or did, she would never truly belong in their world. She could leave. Should leave. Let her mother make excuses, retreat with whatever dignity remained, prove to them all that she knew her place. Clara stood. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. She could feel her mother's panic, could see Mrs. Ashworth's triumphant smile, could sense the collective anticipation of her humiliation. She spoke carefully, shaping each word with the precision her governess had drilled into her. "You're right." Mrs. Ashworth blinked, clearly not expecting agreement. "A gracious young lady should recognize kindness," Clara continued, her voice stronger now. "She should understand her place in society. She should know when to be silent and when to speak." Several women nodded, satisfaction spreading across their faces. "But here's what I've learned," Clara said, and now she let steel enter her voice. "True kindness doesn't need to be diminished or explained away. True grace doesn't come from making yourself small to make others comfortable. And true belonging isn't given by people like you. It's claimed by people brave enough to stand in the light despite the shadows trying to pull them back." The room erupted. Women gasped. Hands flew to throats. Fans snapped open with aggressive precision. Mrs. Ashworth's face went from pale to scarlet. "How dare you?" she began. "How dare I what?" Clara interrupted. "Speak? Defend myself? Refuse to apologize for being seen?" She looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as she could. "You want me to disappear, to admit I'm not worthy of the Duke's attention, to prove that you were right about me all along, that I'm nothing but the broken girl you've always believed me to be. Clara, her mother whispered urgently, pulling at her arm. Please. But Clara couldn't stop now. 22 years of silence, of swallowing her voice, of being talked over and dismissed and pitied, it all came pouring out. But I won't do it, she said. I won't make myself smaller so you can feel bigger. I won't apologize for accepting an invitation to dance, and I won't, she looked directly at Mrs. Ashworth, let you decide what I'm worth. Lady Margaret shot to her feet. This is outrageous. Mrs. Ashworth, surely you're not going to allow this display. Display? Clara turned to face her old nemesis. Like when you called me furniture in front of half of London? Like when you've spent years mocking my silence while pretending to be concerned for my welfare? That kind of display? Lady Margaret's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For once, Clara had rendered her speechless. Clara turned back to Mrs. Ashworth. I'm sorry to have disrupted your musicale, but I won't be apologizing for anything else. She walked out, her head high, her mother scrambling to follow. Behind them, the room exploded into chaos. Voices raised, accusations flying, the careful veneer of civility cracking wide open. In the carriage, Catherine was shaking. Clara, what were you thinking? Do you have any idea what you've just done? Clara did know. She'd just declared war on the very society she was supposed to be trying to rejoin. She'd made enemies of some of the most influential women in London. She'd proven every accusation they'd leveled against her, that she was inappropriate, ungrateful, unsuitable. She'd also never felt more alive. I was thinking, Clara said slowly, that I'm tired of being their victim. Catherine stared at her daughter as if seeing a stranger. You've ruined everything. Everything we've been working toward. After the ball, after the Duke's protection, we had a chance, a real chance, and you've thrown it away. Have I? Clara met her mother's gaze. Or have I just shown them that I'm exactly who Adrian said I was? Someone who doesn't perform, doesn't pretend, doesn't hide. You don't understand, Catherine said desperately. They'll destroy you for this. They'll make sure every door in London is closed to you, and when the Duke hears what you've done, when he realizes how you've embarrassed him, then I'll know he was never worth my time anyway. The words came out stronger than Clara felt, because deep down, beneath the adrenaline and defiance, fear was creeping in. What if her mother was right? What if Adrian had expected her to play the game? To be grateful and submissive and properly ashamed of her limitations? What if she'd just destroyed the only real chance at happiness she'd ever had? She didn't have to wait long for her answer. Adrian arrived at Whitford House before dinner, his face unreadable as he was shown into the drawing room where Clara sat with her parents. Her father looked furious, her mother terrified, and Clara felt her stomach twist into knots. This was it, the moment when Adrian realized his mistake and withdrew his protection. Your Grace, her father began, his voice stiff with forced politeness. We're honored by your visit, though I must apologize for my daughter's behavior this afternoon. I assure you she will be properly disciplined. Adrian held up one hand, silencing him. His gray eyes found Clara's across the room. Leave us, he said. Not a request. A command. Your Grace, I don't think... Catherine started. Please, Adrian said, softer but no less firm. I need to speak with Clara alone. Her parents exchanged glances, then reluctantly withdrew. The door closed behind them with a soft click that Clara felt more than heard. Adrian stood perfectly still for a long moment, just looking at her. Clara forced herself to meet his gaze, to not flinch or apologize or try to explain. If this was the end, she'd face it with the same courage she'd found at Mrs. Ashworth's musicale. I heard what happened, he said finally. I'm sure you did. I imagine all of London has heard by now. They have. A pause. Mrs. Ashworth is telling everyone that you're unstable. Lady Margaret is suggesting you're dangerously delusional. 3 separate matrons have sent me letters expressing their concern about your influence on young ladies who might think rebellion is acceptable. Clara's heart sank, worse than she'd thought then. I see, she said quietly. Adrian took a step closer. Do you know what I told them? Clara shook her head. I told them they were absolutely right. The words landed like a blow. Clara felt tears pricking behind her eyes, felt the familiar weight of disappointment settling over her shoulders. Of course this was how it ended. You are dangerous, Adrian continued, moving closer still. You are rebellious. You do influence people. You certainly influenced me. Because you're the first person I've met in 7 years who values truth over comfort, who would rather stand alone in the light than hide safely in the shadows. Clara's breath caught. What you did today? Adrian shook his head, and now she could see something in his eyes that made her pulse race. Admiration. You stood in front of your worst enemies and told them the truth about themselves. You refused to be diminished. You claimed your own worth instead of waiting for someone to grant it to you. You're not angry? Angry? Adrian laughed, an actual laugh that transformed his entire face. Clara, I'm in awe. Do you know how rare that kind of courage is? How many people spend their entire lives pretending, performing, hiding their real thoughts behind polite smiles and careful words? He was close now, close enough that Clara could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. I asked you not to make yourself small, he said softly. You didn't just refuse, you made yourself enormous. You terrified them, Clara. Because they finally saw what I saw from the beginning. You're stronger than any of them. They hate me now, Clara whispered, more than before. Yes, Adrian agreed. They do. And it will get worse, much worse, because people fear what they can't control, and you've just proven you're uncontrollable. He took her hand, the same gentle but firm grip she remembered from the dance. The ball is tomorrow night. Every eye in London will be watching, waiting to see if you break, if you back down, if you prove them right about you being unsuitable for my world. Clara's throat felt tight. And if I do break, you won't. He said it with such certainty that Clara almost believed him. But if somehow you did, if the weight became too much and you needed to walk away, I'd understand. This isn't a fair fight, Clara. You're one woman against an entire society built on cruelty and exclusion. Then why fight at all? The question came out broken. Why not just find someone easier? Someone who fits? Adrian's hand came up to her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. The touch was gentle, almost reverent. Because I don't want easy, he said. I don't want someone who fits into boxes built by small-minded people. I want... He paused, searching for words. I want someone real. Someone brave, someone who makes me want to be better than the cold, calculating duke they all think I am. I'm terrified, Clara admitted. Good, so am I. Adrian smiled slightly. But I learned something in the years since my father died. The only things worth having are the things that terrify you. Everything else is just comfortable mediocrity. He stepped back, releasing her hand, and Clara immediately missed the warmth of his touch. Tomorrow night, he said, I'm going to ask you to dance again. In front of everyone who thinks you're unsuitable. Everyone who sent those threatening letters, yes, I know about those. Everyone who believes you're reaching above your station. They'll be vicious. Undoubtedly. Adrian's expression hardened. Which is why I'm not just asking you to dance. I'm asking you to stand beside me and show them that their cruelty means nothing, that we set the terms of our own worth, not them. Clara felt something fierce and bright kindling in her chest. And if I say yes, then we finish what we started, together. He paused. But Clara, you need to understand what you're agreeing to. This won't be like Mrs. Ashworth's musicale, where you can leave after making your point. Tomorrow night, you'll be walking into Blackmore House as my invited guest, under my protection. The entire aristocracy will be there, and they will try to break you. How? Adrian's jaw tightened. They'll mock you, question you, test you to see if you understand conversations you can't hear. They'll make you feel like a fraud, an imposter, someone who doesn't belong. They'll smile to your face and destroy you the moment you turn your back. And you, Clara asked, where will you be while they're breaking me? Right beside you, every moment, every attack. His eyes met hers, fierce and determined. But I need you to choose this, Clara. Not because I'm asking, but because you want it, because you're willing to fight for it. Clara thought about her life before the ball. Invisible, quiet, safe in her shadows. Then she thought about the past 2 weeks, attacked, threatened, mocked, but seen, really, truly seen by someone who looked at her and found her worthy. "I choose it," she said. "I choose you. I choose this fight." Adrian's expression shifted into something Clara couldn't quite name. Relief? Gratitude? Or something deeper, something neither of them was quite ready to voice? "Then I'll see you tomorrow night," he said. "Wear something that makes you feel powerful. You're going to need it." He left then, striding out of the drawing room with that same controlled grace. Clara stood alone, her hand still tingling where he'd touched her face, her heart racing with equal parts terror and exhilaration. Her mother rushed in the moment Adrian's carriage pulled away. "What did he say? Clara, you must tell me everything." But Clara just shook her head and went to her room. Some things were too precious to share, too fragile to expose to her mother's anxiety and her father's disappointment. Tomorrow night, she would face London's cruelty head-on. Tomorrow night, she would either prove herself worthy of standing beside a duke, or she would be destroyed trying. Either way, she would do it on her own terms. The day of the ball dawned gray and cold, rain pattering against Clara's window like fingers seeking entry. She spent the morning in her room, trying to calm the storm of nerves in her stomach. Emily brought breakfast that Clara couldn't eat, tea that went cold while she stared into space, imagining every terrible scenario that might unfold tonight. In the afternoon, a package arrived from Blackmore House. Clara opened it to find the most beautiful gown she'd ever seen, midnight blue silk that seemed to capture starlight, with delicate silver embroidery along the bodice and hem. A note was tucked inside. "You said you wanted to feel powerful. Power looks different on everyone. This is how I see you, dark and bright at once, impossible to ignore." Clara held the dress against herself and looked in the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the invisible girl who'd haunted ballrooms for 3 seasons. She was someone new, someone dangerous, someone who might actually survive the night ahead. As evening fell, Emily helped her dress, her fingers trembling as she fastened each button. "You look like a queen, miss," she signed clumsily. "They won't know what hit them." Clara hoped she was right. The carriage ride to Blackmore House felt both endless and too short. Catherine sat across from her, resplendent in emerald silk, her face a mask of controlled anxiety. Her father had refused to attend, whether from anger or embarrassment, Clara wasn't sure. "Remember," Catherine said, speaking slowly so Clara could read her lips. "Stay close to the Duke. Don't wander off alone. And for heaven's sake, don't let anyone provoke you into another outburst like at Mrs. Ashworth's." Clara nodded, but she wasn't really listening. Her attention was on the mansion rising before them, Blackmore House, with its imposing stone facade and windows blazing with light. She could see carriages lined up for what seemed like miles, London's finest all arriving to witness her downfall, or her triumph. The choice, she realized, was entirely hers. They were announced at the entrance, Lady Catherine Whitford and Miss Clara Whitford, and Clara felt every eye in the massive ballroom turn toward them. The crowd was even larger than at Ashford Hall, easily 400 people, all dressed in their finest, all watching to see what would happen when the deaf girl dared to enter the Duke's domain. Clara scanned the room, searching for Adrian. She found him near the far wall, surrounded by a cluster of nobles all vying for his attention. The moment their eyes met, he excused himself and began cutting through the crowd toward her. The whispers started immediately. Clara couldn't hear them, but she could see them spreading like ripples in water. See the fans fluttering, the heads turning, the lips forming her name over and over. Adrian reached her side and offered his arm. "You came. Did you think I wouldn't?" "I hoped you would. There's a difference." He looked at her mother. "Lady Whitford, I hope you don't mind if I steal your daughter for the opening dance?" Catherine's eyes went wide, but she nodded mutely. The opening dance was traditionally the most important of the evening, the host's declaration of who mattered most. Adrian was claiming Clara in front of everyone. He led her onto the dance floor, and the crowd parted like they were carrying plague. Clara could see the reactions: shock, outrage, fascination, disgust. Lady Margaret looked like she might faint. Mrs. Ashworth's expression was pure venom. The orchestra began to play. Clara couldn't hear the music, but she could feel it now, the vibration through the floor, the movement of bodies around them, the subtle shift in Adrian's stance as he prepared to lead. They began to dance. This time, Clara didn't stumble. She'd spent the past 2 weeks practicing in her room, learning to feel rhythm through her feet, to read the patterns in Adrian's body. She wasn't perfect, would never be perfect, but she was competent, real, herself. And that, she realized, was exactly the point. As they moved across the floor, Adrian leaned close enough that she could read his lips. They're staring. Let them. Some of them look like they're plotting murder. Let them try. Adrian's eyes gleamed with something fierce. There's my warrior. The dance continued, each turn taking them past clusters of aristocrats whose expressions ranged from scandalized to calculating. Clara caught fragments of conversations by reading lips. Outrageous, unsuitable. What is he thinking? But she kept her chin high and her eyes on Adrian. When the music finally ended, Adrian didn't immediately release her. Instead, he held her hand and turned to face the assembled crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs, thank you for coming tonight. As many of you know, I haven't hosted a ball in 7 years. I stopped because I found the entire affair tedious. Pretentious people performing pretentious courtships, all carefully calculated to secure advantageous matches while pretending to care about love, or compatibility, or anything real. The room had gone deadly silent. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. But I've recently been reminded, Adrian continued, his hand tightening on Clara's, that occasionally, very occasionally, you meet someone who makes all the performance worthwhile. Someone who is exactly who they appear to be, with no artifice, no pretense, no carefully constructed facade. He looked directly at Clara, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. This wasn't the Ice Duke. This was someone raw and real and terrifyingly vulnerable. Miss Clara Whitford is that person, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. She's braver than anyone in this room, including myself. She faces each day in a world built to exclude her and refuses to be diminished. She speaks truth when others hide behind politeness. She stands in the light when it would be easier, safer, to hide in shadows. Lady Margaret made a sound of protest, but Adrian ignored her completely. I know many of you have been speculating about my interest in Miss Whitford, he continued, wondering if it's charity or mockery or some elaborate social experiment. Allow me to clarify. It's none of those things. It's simply this. I see in her everything I wish I had the courage to be. The room erupted. Voices rose in shock and anger and excitement. Several women looked faint. Clara's mother had her hand pressed to her throat, her face white. But Adrian wasn't finished. And now, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos, I'd like to make an announcement. The crowd fell silent again, everyone straining to hear what came next. Adrian turned to Clara, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the rest of the room disappear. When he spoke, she could read every word on his lips, could see the truth in every micro-expression. Miss Whitford, he said, and then he dropped to one knee. The ballroom exploded. Women screamed. Men shouted. Somewhere, crystal shattered. But Clara's entire world had narrowed to the man kneeling before her, holding a small velvet box containing a ring that caught the chandelier light and threw it back in 1,000 fractured pieces. I know this is unconventional, Adrian said, speaking only to her now, the crowd forgotten. I know we've barely known each other a month. I know by every rule of society, this is too fast, too public, too inappropriate. He opened the box. The ring inside was platinum and sapphire, dark blue like her dress, like midnight, like the depths of the ocean. But I also know that I've spent 7 years looking for someone real in a world full of carefully crafted lies. And I found you. So I'm asking, in front of everyone who thinks you're unsuitable, everyone who believes you don't belong, everyone who has spent their lives trying to make you feel less than, Clara Whitford, will you marry me? The question hung in the air like a blade. This was it, the moment that would define the rest of her life. If she said yes, she'd be binding herself to a man she'd known for barely a month, stepping into a role she had no training for, making herself a permanent target for everyone in this room who already hated her. If she said no, she'd be safe, could retreat back into her shadows, her invisibility, her quiet life of being properly pitied and safely ignored. Clara looked at Adrian, really looked at him, saw past the Duke, past the power and the wealth and the protection he could offer, saw the man underneath, the one who was as tired of performance as she was, the one who'd risked his entire reputation to show her she was worthy. She saw herself reflected in his eyes, not broken, not limited, not less than, whole. Clara opened her mouth to answer, and the entire ballroom held its breath. But before she could speak, the doors at the far end of the ballroom burst open. A man strode in, mud-spattered and wild-eyed, waving a document over his head. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Stop this madness! I have proof. Proof that Clara Whitford is a fraud." The crowd turned as one, shock rippling through the ballroom like a wave. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. The man was Lord Edmund Hartley, a minor noble she'd met perhaps twice in her life. What proof could he possibly have? What fraud could he be talking about? Adrian rose slowly, his body going rigid with controlled fury. "Lord Hartley, you will explain yourself. Now." "Gladly." Hartley held up the document, his expression triumphant. "This is a letter from a physician in Bath, a Dr. Samuel Morrison. He treated Miss Whitford when she was 16 years old, and according to his records, her deafness isn't congenital. It isn't even real." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Clara's world stopped. Hartley's voice rose above the din. "Miss Whitford can hear perfectly well. She's been faking her affliction for years, lying to everyone, including you, Your Grace, in some sick attempt to garner sympathy and secure an advantageous match." "That's not true!" Clara's voice came out too loud, too desperate. "I can't. I don't." But the damage was done. She could see it spreading through the crowd like poison. Doubt, suspicion, the terrible eagerness of people who'd always wanted her to fail finally getting their wish. Lady Margaret's voice cut through the noise. "I knew it! I always knew there was something false about her." "She's been playing us all for fools," Mrs. Ashworth added, her face flushed with vindication. Adrian stood frozen beside Clara, his face completely blank. That terrible ice mask she remembered from the first night was back, and behind it, she couldn't read anything at all. "Adrian," she said desperately, gripping his arm. "Adrian, please, you have to believe me. I don't know what that letter says, but it's not true. I can't hear. I've never been able to." He pulled away from her touch. The movement was small, barely noticeable, but Clara felt it like a knife to the chest. He'd pulled away. He thought she'd been lying. "Your Grace," Hartley pressed forward, holding out the letter. "You can read it yourself. Dr. Morrison's diagnosis was clear. Miss Whitford's hearing is completely normal. Whatever performance she's been giving is exactly that, a performance." Adrian took the letter. His eyes scanned the page, and with each word his expression grew colder, harder, more unreachable. Clara watched her world collapse, watched as the one person who'd ever truly seen her looked at her and saw a stranger, a liar, someone who'd deceived him. "Adrian," she tried again, her voice breaking. "Please." He looked up from the letter, and the expression in his eyes made Clara want to die. Not anger, worse than anger, disappointment, betrayal. "Is there," he said slowly, each word carefully controlled, "any truth to these accusations?" And that's when Clara understood. He was giving her a chance, one chance to explain, to defend herself, to prove this was all some terrible mistake. But how could she defend against a lie from a doctor she barely remembered? How could she prove she couldn't hear when the evidence of her voice, her ability to speak, to read lips, to function in a hearing world, suggested otherwise? The room pressed in around her, hundreds of eyes watching, waiting, eager to see her fall. Clara opened her mouth, searching desperately for words that would make him believe her, make him see her again the way he had just moments ago. But all that came out was, "I don't know." Adrian's face shuddered completely. "You don't know," he repeated, his voice flat. "You don't know if you've been lying about being deaf?" "No, yes, Clara was drowning, the words tangling in her throat. "I am deaf. I can't hear. I don't know what that letter says, but it's wrong. It has to be wrong." "Has to be?" Lady Margaret's voice dripped poison. "Or is it just inconvenient?" The crowd was circling now, sharks sensing blood in the water. Clara could see the eagerness on their faces, the vindication, the terrible joy of watching someone fall from grace. "Your Grace," Hartley said smugly, "I suggest you rescind your proposal. Miss Whitford has clearly been deceiving you, deceiving all of us for her own mercenary purposes. Adrian looked at the letter again, then at Clara, then at the ring still in his hand, the sapphire catching the light and throwing it back in broken pieces. He closed the box with a soft click that Clara felt like a door slamming shut. The engagement, he said quietly, is postponed until this matter can be properly investigated. Not canceled, postponed. But the effect was the same. The room erupted in whispers and gasps and barely concealed laughter. Clara stood alone in the center of the ballroom, her midnight blue dress suddenly feeling like a costume, her brief moment of power crumbling to dust. She'd been so close, so impossibly close to having everything, and now it was gone. Adrian turned away from her, his shoulders rigid, his face a mask of cold fury. Clara wanted to chase after him, to grab his arm, to make him look at her and see the truth. But her feet wouldn't move, her voice wouldn't work. She stood paralyzed while her entire world shattered around her. Her mother appeared at her elbow, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. "We're leaving," Catherine hissed. "Now, before this gets any worse." But it couldn't get worse. This was the worst. This was everything Clara had feared. Being exposed as a fraud, losing Adrian's trust, becoming the laughingstock of London. Except she wasn't a fraud. She couldn't hear. She'd never been able to hear. So where had that letter come from? And why now, at this exact moment when she'd finally found something real? As her mother dragged her toward the exit, Clara caught one last glimpse of Adrian. He stood surrounded by nobles all talking at once, his face carved from ice, the ring box still clutched in his hand. He didn't look at her, not even once. And Clara understood with terrible clarity that she was exactly where she'd started, invisible, dismissed, alone. Only this time she'd tasted what it meant to be seen, and losing it might actually destroy her. Only this time she'd tasted what it meant to be seen, and losing it might actually destroy her. The carriage ride home was silent in a way that had nothing to do with Clara's deafness. Catherine sat rigid across from her, face pale, hands trembling in her lap. Every few moments her lips would move, forming words, questions, accusations, but she'd catch herself and fall silent again. Clara stared out the window at the dark streets of London, seeing nothing. Her mind kept replaying the moment Adrian closed the ring box. The soft click, the way he'd turned away, the ice settling back over his features like a mask he'd worn for so long it had become his real face. She'd been so close. When they arrived at Whitford House, Clara went straight to her room, ignoring her mother's attempts to follow. She locked the door and stood in the darkness, still wearing the midnight blue dress that was supposed to make her feel powerful. Instead, she felt like a fool. A knock came at the door an hour later, then another. Finally, her father's voice, muffled but insistent enough that Clara could feel the vibrations. "Clara, open this door immediately!" She ignored him, ignored them all. What was there to say? What explanation could she possibly give when she didn't understand what had happened herself? Dr. Samuel Morrison. The name meant nothing to her. She'd seen dozens of doctors over the years, her parents' desperate attempts to fix her, to find some cure that would make their daughter normal. Most of them had been charlatans or well-meaning incompetents. She couldn't remember half their names. But one of them had apparently written a letter claiming she could hear. Why? For what purpose? And more importantly, who had given that letter to Lord Hartley, and why had they chosen tonight, of all nights, to reveal it? Clara's mind began to work, cutting through the emotional chaos with the cold precision she'd learned from years of observation. This wasn't random. The timing was too perfect. Hartley had burst through those doors at the exact moment Adrian proposed, wielding evidence that would cause maximum damage. Someone had orchestrated this. But who and why? Clara crossed to her writing desk and pulled out the anonymous letters she'd been collecting. She spread them across the surface, studying each one with fresh eyes. Different handwriting, different paper, all designed to seem like they came from various sources. But there was a pattern. Certain phrases appeared in multiple letters, a particular way of forming the letter R. Small inconsistencies that suggested these hadn't come from dozens of different people. They'd come from one person trying to look like many. Clara grabbed paper and pen and began to write. Not to Adrian, she didn't know what she could say to him yet, but to someone who might actually help her. "Emily," she wrote, "I need you to do something for me. It's dangerous, and I'll understand if you refuse, but I need someone I can trust, and right now you're the only person in the world who fits that description." She outlined her plan, watching the ink dry on words that could either save her or finish destroying whatever remained of her reputation. Then she sealed the letter and slipped it under her door. Morning came too soon. Clara had barely slept, her mind churning through possibilities and plans. When Emily entered with the breakfast tray, her eyes were red-rimmed but determined. She set down the tray and signed, "I'll do it, whatever you need." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Emily squeezed her hand. "You're the bravest person I know, miss. If you say you can't hear, then you can't hear, and we're going to prove it." After Emily left, Clara forced herself to eat, to dress, to prepare for what came next. She chose a simple day dress of gray wool, nothing dramatic, nothing that screamed for attention. Today wasn't about being seen. Today was about seeing. Her father intercepted her in the hallway. His face was haggard, aged 10 years overnight. "Clara, we need to talk." She followed him to his study where her mother already sat, a handkerchief twisted in her hands. Both parents looked at Clara with expressions somewhere between pity and anger. "Lord Hartley has already been to see me this morning," her father said heavily. "He's demanding we make a public statement acknowledging your deception." "I didn't deceive anyone," Clara said carefully. "Then explain the letter." Catherine's voice broke. "Explain how a doctor could have written that you can hear when you claim you can't." "I don't know," Clara admitted. "But I'm going to find out." Her father's expression hardened. "You'll do no such thing. You'll stay in this house until this scandal dies down." "It won't die down," Clara interrupted. "Don't you see? Someone orchestrated this. Someone wanted to destroy me at that exact moment in that exact way. And if we just hide and wait, they've won." "Who?" Catherine demanded. "Who would go to such lengths?" Clara thought about the letters, the timing, the systematic way she'd been isolated and attacked. "Someone who has a great deal to lose if I marry Adrian. Someone with influence and resources and a talent for manipulation." Recognition dawned on her mother's face. "Lady Margaret, or Mrs. Ashworth, or any of a dozen other women who see me as a threat to the natural order." Clara met her father's eyes. "I'm going to Bath, to find Dr. Morrison and get the truth." "Absolutely not," her father said. "I forbid it." "Then forbid it, but I'm going anyway." Clara stood, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "You can lock me in my room, but I'll climb out the window. You can take away my allowance, but I'll walk if I have to, because I'm not going to let them destroy me without a fight." Reginald Whitford stared at his daughter like he'd never seen her before. Perhaps he hadn't. Perhaps he'd only ever seen the broken girl who needed to be hidden, protected, apologized for. "You've changed," he said quietly. "Yes," Clara agreed. "I have." By afternoon, Clara was on a coach to Bath, Emily beside her despite her parents' protests. The journey would take most of the day, and every mile felt like an eternity. But Clara used the time to prepare, to plan, to ready herself for whatever truth she might find. What if the letter was real? What if some doctor she couldn't remember had actually examined her and found her hearing intact? What if she'd been wrong about herself her entire life? No. She pushed the thought away. She knew her own body, her own experience. She couldn't hear, had never been able to hear. Whatever that letter said, it was wrong. It had to be. They arrived in Bath as the sun was setting, the city's famous Georgian architecture glowing golden in the fading light. Clara had been here before, years ago, for one of her mother's many attempts to find a cure. She remembered hating it, the constant parade of doctors poking and prodding, the mineral baths that were supposed to miraculously restore her hearing, the disappointed faces when nothing changed. Finding Dr. Morrison's address took some effort. The man had retired from active practice, but he still maintained an office where he kept his records. Emily did the talking, Clara's presence concealed beneath a heavy cloak. They were shown into a cramped office that smelled of old paper and tobacco. Dr. Morrison was a thin, elderly man with liver-spotted hands and rheumy eyes that widened when he saw Clara. "Miss Whitford," he said, his lips easy to read in the lamplight. "I wondered if you might come." Clara's heart sank. So he did remember her, did write the letter. "You know why I'm here," she said, speaking carefully. "I can guess." Morrison gestured to chairs, but neither Clara nor Emily sat. "You want to know about the letter I supposedly wrote to Lord Hartley." "Supposedly?" Clara's pulse quickened. Morrison's expression turned grim. "I wrote no such letter. Oh, I treated you when you were 16. Your mother brought you here convinced I could cure your deafness with some new electrical therapy she'd read about. Nonsense, of course. I examined you, confirmed that your hearing loss was profound and congenital. Told your mother there was nothing to be done. She was displeased." Clara's knees felt weak. Then the letter, a forgery, and not even a particularly good one. Morrison crossed to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. "This is my actual record of your treatment. Note the date, the diagnosis, the recommendation. Patient presents with complete bilateral sensorineural hearing loss, likely congenital. No treatment indicated or available. I keep meticulous records, Miss Whitford. Have for 40 years. He handed her the file. Clara's hands trembled as she read the spidery handwriting that confirmed everything she'd known about herself. She wasn't lying, wasn't faking. The letter Hartley had presented was a fraud. "Why didn't you come forward," she asked, "when you heard about the accusation?" "I only learned of it this morning, when Lord Hartley himself arrived demanding I confirm the contents of my letter." Morrison's face darkened. "I told him in no uncertain terms that I'd written no such thing, and that my records proved otherwise. He became quite agitated. Threatened me, actually." "Threatened you how?" "Said if I didn't support his version of events, he'd ruin my reputation. Claim I was senile, incompetent. I'm 73 years old, Miss Whitford. My career is behind me. I don't care what some pompous lordling thinks of me." Morrison's eyes glinted. "But I care very much about the truth. And the truth is that someone forged my name to a lie designed to destroy you." Clara felt something fierce and bright igniting in her chest. Proof. She had proof. "Will you testify to this?" she asked. "In London, in front of everyone who believed the forgery?" Morrison studied her for a long moment. "That would cause quite a scandal." "Yes," Clara agreed. "It would. Might make enemies of powerful people." "Almost certainly." Morrison smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Well then, I've always been partial to a good scandal. When do we leave?" They returned to London 2 days later, traveling in a hired carriage with Dr. Morrison and his meticulously kept records. Clara had sent a message ahead to Adrian, asking him to gather everyone who'd been at the ball. Lady Margaret, Mrs. Ashworth, Lord Hartley, anyone who'd witnessed her humiliation. She didn't know if he'd do it, didn't know if he'd even read her letter, but she had to try. The message that came back was brief. "Blackmore House, tomorrow at noon. Come prepared to prove everything." So he was giving her a chance, one chance to defend herself in front of everyone who'd condemned her. Clara spent the evening preparing with Morrison, going over every detail of his records, anticipating every question they might face. Emily helped her dress in a simple but elegant gown of deep burgundy, not quite mourning, but serious, armored. The carriage ride to Blackmore House the next morning felt like riding to her own execution. But this time, Clara wasn't alone. Morrison sat across from her, his medical bag containing years of carefully documented proof. Emily sat beside her, a quiet source of strength. And somewhere in that house, Adrian waited. The man who'd seen her, believed in her, proposed to her, and then pulled away when the world told him she was a lie. Would he believe her now? Or had the damage been too deep? The ballroom looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, less magical. But it was packed with people. Every noble who'd witnessed Clara's humiliation, plus several more drawn by curiosity or malice. Adrian stood at the front of the room, his face an expressionless mask. Their eyes met across the crowd, and Clara couldn't read anything in his gaze. No warmth, no coldness. Just waiting. Lord Hartley stood beside him, his expression smug. Lady Margaret and Mrs. Ashworth occupied the front row of chairs, both looking eager for the spectacle to begin. This was it. Clara's one chance to prove she wasn't a liar. She walked to the front of the room, Morrison and Emily flanking her. The crowd fell silent, everyone leaning forward to catch whatever came next. Adrian spoke first, his voice carrying easily in the large space. "Miss Whitford, you claimed you had evidence that would refute Lord Hartley's accusations. We're ready to hear it." "Not I'm ready, we're ready." As if he'd already aligned himself with the crowd against her, Clara forced down the hurt. This wasn't about their relationship anymore. This was about truth. "Lord Hartley," she said, turning to face him directly, "presented a letter supposedly written by Dr. Samuel Morrison claiming my deafness was fraudulent. I've brought Dr. Morrison himself to address those claims." Hartley's face paled slightly, but he recovered quickly. "The doctor is elderly, clearly senile. He probably doesn't even remember treating you." "On the contrary," Morrison said, stepping forward with surprising vigor, "I remember Miss Whitford quite well. I've been practicing medicine for over 50 years, and I've kept detailed records of every patient I've ever treated. Would you like to see them?" He pulled out a leather-bound journal, open to a page marked with a ribbon. "This is my entry from September 14th, 1809. Clara Whitford, age 16, brought by her mother for evaluation of profound deafness. Physical examination reveals no obvious abnormalities of the outer or middle ear. Patient responds to no auditory stimuli, including loud percussion sounds directly behind her head. Diagnosis: complete bilateral sensorineural hearing loss, likely congenital. Prognosis: no treatment available. Advised mother to accept condition and focus on teaching patient to communicate through alternative means." Morrison looked up, his gaze sharp despite his age. "That is what I wrote. That is what I diagnosed, and I stand by every word." "That proves nothing," Hartley said, his voice rising. "You could have written that entry yesterday." "The ink is 17 years old," Morrison said calmly, as any expert could confirm. "The journal itself shows natural aging and wear, and I have a witness, my assistant at the time, who helped me examine Miss Whitford and who is willing to testify to the same facts." The crowd erupted in whispers. Clara watched Hartley's face cycle through emotions: confusion, anger, fear. "Then the letter I received," Adrian began. "Is a forgery," Morrison interrupted. "I've examined it. The handwriting is similar to mine, but not identical. The phrasing is wrong. I would never use the term mute to describe Miss Whitford, as she clearly has the capacity for speech, only lacks hearing. And most damningly, the letter is dated last month. I haven't treated Miss Whitford in 17 years. Adrian's expression shifted, ice beginning to crack. "Lord Hartley, where did you obtain this letter?" Hartley's confidence was crumbling. It was delivered to me, anonymously." "How convenient," Adrian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous softness. "And you didn't think to verify its authenticity before using it to destroy Miss Whitford's reputation." "I had no reason to doubt." "You had every reason to verify," Adrian cut him off. "Unless your goal was never truth, but simply destruction." He turned to the crowd. "Someone in this room, or someone connected to someone in this room, forged a medical document, delivered it to Lord Hartley, and timed its revelation for maximum damage. Someone wanted to destroy Miss Whitford. The question is who?" The crowd shifted uneasily. Clara watched faces carefully, looking for any tell, any sign of guilt. And there, a flash of something in Mrs. Ashworth's expression. Fear? Anger? She was gripping her fan so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Mrs. Ashworth," Clara said quietly. All eyes turned to her. "You seem distressed." "I'm distressed by this entire sordid affair," Mrs. Ashworth said, but her voice wavered. "You were the one who first suggested I was unsuitable for the Duke's attention," Clara continued, taking a step closer. "At your musicale, you gave quite a speech about young ladies who overreach, about knowing one's place. I was merely stating what everyone was thinking. And you've been friends with Lord Hartley for years, haven't you? His mother and you were quite close before her death." Mrs. Ashworth's face went pale. "What are you implying?" Clara pulled out the anonymous letters she'd received, holding them up. These letters were supposedly from different people, but they share certain characteristics, certain phrases, a particular way of forming letters. She looked directly at Mrs. Ashworth. I wonder what a handwriting expert would say if we compared them to your correspondence. This is outrageous. Mrs. Ashworth stood, her composure shattering. I won't be accused by some charlatan who's been lying about her condition for years. Dr. Morrison has just proven she hasn't been lying, Adrian said, his voice cold as winter. Which means someone else has. Someone who had access to medical terminology, who could forge a doctor's handwriting convincingly enough to fool a cursory inspection, who had the resources to deliver the forgery anonymously. He moved closer to Mrs. Ashworth, and Clara saw real fear flash across the woman's face. Someone who desperately wanted to prevent my engagement to Miss Whitford. Someone who believed she was protecting the social order by removing an unsuitable candidate. Your Grace, surely you can't believe it. I believe the evidence, Adrian said, and the evidence suggests you're guilty. Mrs. Ashworth's face went through a rapid series of changes: denial, anger, desperation. Then finally, something broke. She doesn't belong. The words burst out like a confession. You're a duke. You could have anyone, princesses, heiresses, women of proper breeding, and instead you chose her? A deaf girl who can't even participate in a normal conversation? Who makes a spectacle of herself at every opportunity? The room went deadly silent. I did what needed to be done, Mrs. Ashworth continued, her voice shaking. Someone had to stop this madness before you ruined yourself, before you lowered the standards for all of us. If we allow people like her into our ranks, where does it end? People like her? Adrian's voice was soft, dangerous. You mean people who are brave, honest, who refuse to let their limitations define them? I mean defective, Mrs. Ashworth shrieked. The word echoed in the ballroom like a gunshot. She's defective, and everyone knows it, and marrying her would be the greatest mistake of your life. No one moved. No one breathed. Then Adrian smiled, and it was the coldest expression Clara had ever seen. You're right about one thing, he said. This would be the greatest decision of my life, just not a mistake. He turned to Clara, and suddenly his expression transformed. The ice melted, and underneath was something raw and real and achingly vulnerable. I'm sorry. I should have trusted you from the beginning, should have known that someone who faced the world with the courage you've shown would never resort to lies. He crossed to her in 3 long strides and took her hands in his. I let doubt poison what I knew to be true. I let fear make me weak when you needed me to be strong. Can you forgive me? Clara felt tears streaming down her face. There's nothing to forgive. There's everything to forgive. Adrian's thumbs brushed away her tears. But if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. He dropped to one knee again, right there in front of everyone who'd tried to destroy them. Clara Whitford, will you marry me? Not because I pity you, not because I'm being kind, but because you're the strongest, bravest, most remarkable person I've ever met, and I can't imagine spending my life with anyone else. The sapphire ring appeared again, catching the light. This time, Clara didn't hesitate. Yes. The ballroom erupted, but this time in cheers, not gasps. Not everyone was happy. Lady Margaret looked like she'd bitten into something sour, and several others wore expressions of disgust. But enough people were smiling, applauding, celebrating. The tide was turning. Adrian stood and pulled Clara into his arms, and she felt the tremor running through him, relief, joy, residual fear that he'd almost lost her. I love you, he whispered against her hair. I should have said it before. Should have told you every day since I first saw you. Clara pulled back to read his lips, to make sure she understood. You love me? Desperately, completely, forever. He smiled. Is that acceptable? It's perfect. Clara stood on her toes to kiss him, not caring that they had an audience, not caring about propriety or scandal or what anyone thought. She'd been invisible for 22 years. She was done hiding. When they finally broke apart, Mrs. Ashworth had fled. Lord Hartley looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, and Dr. Morrison was accepting congratulations from several nobles who apparently appreciated a good scandal with a happy ending. Lady Margaret remained in her seat, her face a mask of fury. This isn't over, she said loudly. Society will never accept her. You're making a terrible mistake, Your Grace. Adrian turned to face her, and his expression was pure steel. Society will accept her because I say they will. And anyone who disagrees will find themselves no longer welcome in any house that values my opinion. Are we clear, Lady Margaret? The threat was explicit, absolute. The Ice Duke wasn't making a request. He was establishing a new order. Lady Margaret's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Finally, she stood stiffly and walked out, her spine rigid with defeated pride. One by one, the remaining nobles approached to offer congratulations. Some genuine, some clearly calculating their new social position in a world where Clara Whitford would be a duchess. Clara accepted them all with grace, but she kept one hand in Adrian's, anchoring herself to the one thing that was real. As the crowd began to disperse, Emily appeared at Clara's side, her face glowing with tears and joy. She signed frantically, "You did it! You actually did it!" Clara pulled her into a hug, this woman who'd risked everything to help prove the truth. "We did it," she corrected. Dr. Morrison approached, his weathered face creased in a genuine smile. "Well, Miss Whitford, or should I say future Duchess, I believe I can safely say this is the most eventful patient follow-up I've ever conducted." "Thank you," Clara said, gripping his hand, "for keeping those records, for coming to London, for telling the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent." "The truth is never easy," Morrison said, "but it's always worth fighting for." He glanced at Adrian. "Take care of her, Your Grace. She's 1 in a million." "I know," Adrian said simply. "Believe me, I know." As Morrison took his leave and the ballroom finally emptied, Clara and Adrian stood alone in the space where she'd been humiliated and redeemed in equal measure. "What happens now?" Clara asked. Adrian pulled her close, and she felt his heartbeat against her cheek, steady, strong, real. "Now? Now we plan a wedding. Now we show London that we meant every word. Now we build a life together that's exactly what we want it to be, regardless of what anyone else thinks it should be." "They'll never fully accept me," Clara said. "Some of them will always see me as less than." "Let them." Adrian's arms tightened around her. Their acceptance was never the point. The point was finding each other, finding someone real in a world full of lies. Everything else is just noise. Clara thought about the letters still tucked in her drawer at home, the whispers that would probably never fully stop, the people who would always view her deafness as a weakness, a flaw, something that made her unsuitable. Then she thought about standing in this ballroom with Adrian kneeling before her, declaring his love in front of everyone who'd tried to tear them apart. Thought about the strength she'd found in herself, not despite her deafness, but woven through it, inseparable from who she was. "You're right," she said. "It is just noise." And for once in her life, being unable to hear it felt like a blessing rather than a curse. Adrian tilted her chin up, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I have one more question." "Yes?" "How soon can we get married? Because waiting feels impossible right now." Clara laughed, a sound she couldn't modulate perfectly, didn't care to try. "Is that the Duke of Blackmore admitting to impatience?" "That's a man who's spent 7 years waiting for something real admitting he doesn't want to wait anymore." Adrian's smile was soft, genuine, nothing like the ice mask he showed the world. "So? How soon?" Clara pretended to consider, though her heart was already racing with joy. 3 weeks. Enough time to plan properly, but not so long that anything else can go wrong." 3 weeks, Adrian agreed. "And Clara? Nothing else will go wrong. I promise you that." He couldn't promise that, of course. Life was unpredictable, and London society was cruel. There would be more whispers, more challenges, more people who thought a deaf woman had no business being a duchess. But standing there in Adrian's arms, Clara realized something fundamental had changed. She wasn't afraid of them anymore. Wasn't afraid of being seen, of taking up space, of demanding to be treated as worthy. Because she was worthy. Not despite her deafness, not even because of it. Just worthy. Full stop. And anyone who couldn't see that wasn't worth her time. 3 weeks, she agreed, rising up to kiss him again. "And then I'm yours forever." "You're already mine," Adrian murmured against her lips. "Have been since the moment you took my hand and danced despite your terror. I just had to catch up." Outside Blackmore House, London continued its endless cycle of scandal and gossip. By tomorrow, Every drawing room in the city would be discussing the dramatic confrontation, Mrs. Ashworth's confession, the Duke's unwavering devotion to his unsuitable bride. But inside, in the ballroom where Clara had been both destroyed and redeemed, two people stood wrapped in each other's arms, building something that had nothing to do with society's approval and everything to do with choosing each other, again and again and again. No matter what came next, no matter what came next. What came next was a war Clara hadn't anticipated, not with society's cruelty, but with its desperate attempt at redemption. The morning after the confrontation at Blackmore House, Clara woke to find her mother sitting at the foot of her bed, holding what appeared to be every newspaper in London. Catherine's face was a mixture of shock and something that looked suspiciously like pride. "You need to see this," she said, handing Clara the top paper. The headline screamed across the front page. The Duchess Who Wouldn't Be Silenced. How Clara Whitford Exposed Society's Greatest Fraud. Clara's hands trembled as she read the article. It detailed everything: Mrs. Ashworth's confession, Dr. Morrison's testimony, Adrian's unwavering support. But more than that, it told Clara's story, how she'd faced years of mockery and isolation with quiet dignity, how she'd refused to apologize for existing, how she'd stood before her accusers and demanded truth when lies would have been easier. The writer, someone named Elizabeth Hartwell, had concluded with words that made Clara's throat tight. Miss Whitford's greatest crime was not deception, but visibility. She dared to be seen in a world that preferred her invisible. And in doing so, she's revealed something uncomfortable about the rest of us. That we punish difference not because it's wrong, but because it threatens the comfortable order we've built for ourselves. The question now is whether London society has the courage to change, or whether we'll continue to attack anyone who doesn't fit our narrow definition of acceptable. "There are 6 more just like it," Catherine said quietly, "all defending you, all praising your courage. Clara, you've become something of a sensation." Over the next week, the sensation only grew. Invitations poured into Whitford House, not the polite, obligatory kind Clara had received before, but genuine requests for her presence. Tea with Duchess Eleanor of Somerset, who'd lost her hearing in her 30s and had been quietly fighting similar battles. Lunch with a coalition of ladies who wanted Clara to speak at their charity event about education for deaf children. Most surprisingly, a letter from Princess Charlotte herself, expressing admiration for Clara's courage and requesting a private audience. "This is unprecedented," Clara's father said at dinner one evening, looking at his daughter with something approaching awe. "The princess doesn't grant audiences to anyone without significant political or social importance. Clara has both now," Catherine said, and there was no mistaking the pride in her voice, whether she wanted it or not. Clara wasn't sure what she wanted anymore. Everything was happening so fast. The wedding preparations, the sudden social elevation, the realization that she'd become a symbol of something larger than herself. Women who'd spent years hiding their own differences, their own struggles, were looking to her as proof that visibility was possible, that survival was possible. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. But through it all, Adrian remained her constant. He appeared at Whitford House every day, sometimes for hours, sometimes for mere minutes, stolen between obligations. They walked in the garden, sat in the drawing room with her parents as chaperone, planned their future with the careful excitement of two people who'd almost lost everything. "Are you ready for this?" Adrian asked one afternoon as they reviewed the guest list for their wedding. It had grown from an intimate gathering to a spectacle that would include half the aristocracy and several foreign dignitaries. "No," Clara admitted. "Clara did. But I don't think I'll ever be ready, so we might as well do it anyway." Adrian smiled, that private expression he saved just for her. "That's my warrior." The days blurred together in a whirlwind of fittings and meetings and lessons, because while Clara might have proven her worth, she still had to learn how to be a duchess, a role that came with responsibilities she'd never imagined. The Duchess of Somerset took Clara under her wing, teaching her the intricacies of managing a large household, navigating political dinners, hosting events that served purposes beyond mere entertainment. Eleanor was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, and she didn't coddle. "Being deaf in this world is a weapon if you know how to use it," Eleanor told Clara during one of their sessions. "People will underestimate you, They'll speak freely around you, assuming you can't understand. Let them. Then use what you learn. That seems manipulative, Clara said carefully. Eleanor laughed. Darling, everything in this world is manipulation. The only question is whether you're doing the manipulating or being manipulated. I know which I prefer. It was a cynical view, but Clara couldn't deny its truth. She'd spent her whole life being manipulated by people who thought they knew what was best for her. Maybe it was time to take control of the narrative herself. The day before the wedding, Clara received an unexpected visitor. She was in the drawing room reviewing last-minute details when Emily announced, "Lady Margaret wishes to see you, miss." Clara's stomach dropped. "Did she say why?" "No, miss, but she looks different." Clara almost refused. What could Lady Margaret possibly have to say that Clara wanted to hear? But curiosity won out. "Show her in." Lady Margaret entered looking diminished somehow. She'd always carried herself with such aggressive confidence, but today her shoulders were slightly hunched, her expression carefully neutral. "Miss Whitford," she said, and Clara noticed she didn't use any of the mocking tones that had characterized their previous interactions. "Thank you for seeing me. I know I have no right to ask for your time." Clara gestured to a chair, and they sat across from each other in uncomfortable silence. Finally, Clara spoke. "Why are you here?" Lady Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. "To apologize. For everything. The mockery, the cruelty, the years of treating you as less than human. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." The word should have felt like victory. Clara had imagined this moment. Lady Margaret forced to admit her mistakes, to grovel for forgiveness. But now that it was happening, Clara felt only exhaustion. "Why now?" she asked. "Because I'm marrying a duke? Because I'm suddenly important enough to matter?" "No." Lady Margaret met her eyes. "Because Mrs. Ashworth's confession made me look at myself and realize I've become exactly what I always despised. Someone who tears others down to feel superior. I've spent 40 years in this society, fighting to maintain my position, to prove my worth. And somewhere along the way, I started measuring my worth by how many people I could make feel worthless." She took a shaky breath. "You didn't deserve any of it. You were a child when I first started mocking you, and you grew into a woman far braver than I've ever been. I can't undo the damage I've done, but I wanted you to know that I see it. I see what I was, and I'm ashamed." Clara studied the older woman's face, looking for deception, for manipulation. But all she saw was genuine remorse, and something that looked like self-loathing. "I forgive you," Clara said finally. Lady Margaret's eyes widened. "Just like that?" "Just like that." Clara stood and Lady Margaret scrambled to her feet. "Not because you deserve it, but because I'm tired of carrying the weight of other people's cruelty. I'm about to marry the man I love and become a duchess. I don't have room in my life for bitterness anymore." Lady Margaret's face crumpled slightly. "You're far more gracious than I would be in your position." "Maybe," Clara agreed. "Or maybe I've just learned that holding on to anger only hurts the person doing the holding. You can't change the past, Lady Margaret, but you can choose who you are from this moment forward." After Lady Margaret left, Clara stood at the window watching London go about its business. Tomorrow, she would marry Adrian in front of everyone who tried to destroy her. Tomorrow, she would step into a role she'd never imagined filling. Tomorrow, everything would change. But today she could still be just Clara, the girl who'd spent her life learning to survive in a world that didn't want her. The woman who'd discovered she was stronger than anyone imagined. The woman who'd learned that silence could be its own kind of power. The wedding dawned clear and bright, spring sunlight streaming through Clara's windows and painting everything gold. Emily woke her early, practically vibrating with excitement as she helped Clara bathe and begin the lengthy process of preparing. The wedding gown was a masterpiece. Ivory silk embroidered with tiny seed pearls. The bodice fitted perfectly to Clara's frame, the skirt flowing like water. It had taken 3 seamstresses working around the clock to complete it in time, and when Clara finally stood before the mirror, fully dressed, she barely recognized herself. "You look like a queen," Emily signed, tears streaming down her face. "I look terrified," Clara signed back. "That too." Emily squeezed her hands. "But you're going to be magnificent, just like always." The ceremony was being held at St. James's Cathedral, the largest and most prestigious church in London. As Clara's carriage approached, she could see crowds lining the streets, not just aristocrats, but common people who'd read about her story and come to witness the deaf woman who'd defied society and won. They cheered as she passed, waving handkerchiefs and throwing flowers. Clara couldn't hear them, but she could feel their energy, their excitement, their strange investment in her happiness. "They're calling you the People's Duchess," her father said, sitting beside her in the carriage. For once, he looked at her with unmistakable pride. "You've become a symbol, Clara, for everyone who's ever felt like they didn't belong." Inside the cathedral, the sheer number of people took Clara's breath away. Every pew was filled, every space occupied. Foreign ambassadors sat beside English nobles. Commoners who'd won lottery tickets to attend sat in the upper galleries. And at the front, waiting beside the archbishop, stood Adrian. He turned when she entered, and the expression on his face made every hardship, every moment of doubt, absolutely worth it. Love and awe and something fierce and protective all wrapped together in a look that said, "There you are." Finally. Clara walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and this time there were no whispers of pity or mockery. There was only the rustle of fabric as hundreds of people stood in respect, the soft gasp of appreciation for her gown, the ambient energy of a crowd witnessing something they recognized as significant. When she reached Adrian, he took her hand and whispered something she couldn't hear over the ambient noise. She frowned, confused, and he smiled and signed, "You're beautiful." Clara's breath caught. He'd learned to sign. For her. The ceremony was traditional, the archbishop's lips moving through blessings and pronouncements Clara couldn't fully follow. But it didn't matter. What mattered was Adrian's hand in hers, steady and sure. What mattered was the sapphire ring sliding onto her finger. What mattered was the moment when the archbishop pronounced them married and Adrian pulled her into a kiss that was both tender and possessive, a claim and a promise wrapped into one. The crowd erupted in applause. Clara felt it through the floor, saw it in the sea of smiling faces, understood it in the way the cathedral seemed to vibrate with collective joy. She was a duchess now, the Duchess of Blackmore. The woman who'd survived society's worst and emerged victorious. But more importantly, she was Adrian's, and he was hers. Everything else was just detail. The wedding breakfast was held at Blackmore House, transformed into a fairy tale with flowers and silk and more food than the assembled guests could possibly consume. Clara and Adrian sat at the head table, greeting well-wishers in an endless stream of faces and congratulations. Duchess Eleanor approached with a knowing smile. "Well, you've done it. Married the most eligible bachelor in England and made it look easy." "It wasn't easy," Clara admitted. "The best things never are." Eleanor squeezed her hand. "But you survived. That's what matters. And now you have real power, the kind that comes from position and wealth and a husband who'll support you. Use it wisely." Princess Charlotte herself appeared, resplendent in royal purple. "Your Grace," she said to Clara, the title still strange to hear applied to herself. "I wanted to personally congratulate you and to thank you." "Thank me." Clara was confused. "For showing that strength comes in many forms," Charlotte said. "For proving that the rules we've lived by for so long aren't the only way. For being brave enough to demand better." She leaned closer. "There are changes coming, Duchess, to how we educate our children, to how we treat those with differences, to the very fabric of our society. And much of it will be because you refused to disappear when it would have been easier." As the day wore on, Claire began to understand the magnitude of what she'd done. She wasn't just a woman who'd married well. She was a catalyst for something larger, a shift in how London society viewed difference, worthiness, belonging. Women approached her throughout the afternoon, each with their own story. A mother whose son was born without sight, who'd been told to institutionalize him but now had hope he might have a real future. A young lady who'd lost her hearing to scarlet fever and had been hiding it for years, terrified of becoming a social pariah like Clara had been. An older widow who'd spent decades concealing a speech impediment, suddenly wondering if she might be allowed to just exist as she was. "You gave us permission," one woman said, tears in her eyes. "Permission to be imperfect and still worthy. Do you understand what a gift that is?" Clara hadn't set out to be anyone's symbol or inspiration. She just wanted to survive, to be seen, to have one person look at her and find her worthy. But somehow, in fighting for herself, she'd fought for all of them too. As the sun set and the celebration began to wind down, Adrian pulled Clara aside onto a terrace overlooking London. The city spread out before them, a maze of lights and shadows and endless possibility. "Happy?" he asked, signing the word as he spoke it. "Terrified," Clara signed back. "But yes, happy." "Good." Adrian pulled her close, and she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek. "Because this is just the beginning. Now comes the real work." "What work?" "Changing the world." He said it so matter-of-factly, like it was the most obvious thing. "You've proven it's possible. Now we have to make sure it sticks. Schools for deaf children, legal protections, opportunities for people who've been locked out because of differences that don't actually limit their worth." Clara pulled back to look at his face. "That's a tall order. We have time and resources. And most importantly," Adrian cupped her face in his hands, "we have each other. You taught me that the rules we live by are only as permanent as we allow them to be. So let's rewrite them." Clara thought about everything she'd survived, the years of invisibility, the mockery, the attempts to destroy her, the moment in the ballroom when she'd thought she'd lost everything, and she thought about where she stood now, a duchess with real power, a husband who saw her as an equal, a city full of people looking to her as proof that different didn't mean lesser. "All right," she said, "let's rewrite them." Adrian kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Clara felt something settle inside her chest, the final piece of a puzzle she'd been trying to complete her entire life. Belonging. Not the kind granted by others, but the kind she'd claimed for herself. The recognition that she didn't need to change or hide or apologize to be worthy of love, respect, position. She just needed to be herself, fully and completely, and trust that the right people would see her worth. Everything else was just noise. 6 months later, Clara stood before the first graduating class of the Blackmore Academy for Deaf Education, a school she and Adrian had founded using their combined resources and influence. 30 children, ranging from 5 to 15, all deaf or hard of hearing, all learning to read and write and communicate and claim their own worth. The ceremony was held in the school's assembly hall, with parents and benefactors and several members of parliament in attendance. Clara had been asked to give a speech, which terrified her more than facing down Mrs. Ashworth ever had. But she'd learned something over the past months. Fear wasn't a reason to stay silent. She stood before the assembled crowd and spoke, her voice careful but strong. "When I was a child, I was told that my deafness meant I would never accomplish anything meaningful, that my life would be small and quiet and forgettable, that the best I could hope for was to stay out of the way and not embarrass my family too badly." She paused, looking at the children in the front row, all watching her with bright, hopeful eyes. "I believed that for a very long time. I made myself small. I stayed quiet. I apologized for existing, because that's what the world told me I was supposed to do." Adrian sat in the front row beside Duchess Eleanor, both watching her with expressions of fierce pride. "But then I met someone who looked at me and saw strength instead of weakness, possibility instead of limitation, and it changed everything. Not because he fixed me, I was never broken, but because he gave me permission to stop apologizing and start demanding the world meet me where I was." She gestured to the children. "These students will face people who tell them they're limited, who say they can't achieve certain things because of their deafness, who try to make them feel less than. And I'm here to tell them, and anyone else who needs to hear it, that those people are wrong." The crowd was completely silent, hanging on every word. Deafness isn't a limitation, it's just a different way of experiencing the world. And the only thing limiting what these children can achieve is society's narrow imagination of what's possible. So we're going to expand that imagination. We're going to prove that excellence doesn't require perfect hearing, that leadership can be silent, that the most powerful voices are sometimes the ones that speak without sound. She looked directly at the children now. "You are not broken. You are not less than. You are exactly who you're supposed to be. And anyone who can't see your worth isn't someone whose opinion matters." The assembly hall erupted in applause, parents standing, dabbing at tears, the children themselves signing their appreciation with flying hands. Clara felt emotion threatening to overwhelm her, but she kept her composure, kept her chin high. This was what victory looked like. Not a single moment of triumph, but a sustained commitment to change, to making the world slightly better, slightly more inclusive, slightly more willing to see worth in unexpected places. After the ceremony, as Clara greeted parents and accepted congratulations, a young girl approached, maybe 8 years old, with dark curls and eyes that reminded Clara painfully of herself at that age. The girl signed shyly, "Are you really a duchess?" Clara knelt to be at eye level. "I am. And you're like me? You can't hear?" "Exactly like you." The girl's face transformed with wonder. "So I could be a duchess too, when I grow up?" Clara felt tears prickling her eyes. "You can be anything you want to be. Duchess, doctor, teacher, artist, anything. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The girl threw her arms around Clara's neck in a fierce hug, and Clara held her tight, remembering what it felt like to be that age and believe the world had no place for someone like her. "You belong here," she signed into the girl's hair. "You belong everywhere. Don't ever forget that." That evening, back at Blackmore House, Clara and Adrian sat in his study reviewing reports from the school's first term. The results exceeded all expectations. Students were thriving, learning at rates that challenged every assumption about what deaf children could achieve. "We're going to need to expand," Adrian said, scanning a letter from another aristocrat interested in funding similar schools. 4 more cities have requested programs, and Parliament is actually considering legislation to mandate education for all children, regardless of hearing status. Clara set down her own papers and moved to the window. London spread out below them, a city that had tried to destroy her, and had instead been transformed by her refusal to break. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Choosing me? Your life would have been so much simpler with someone else." Adrian crossed to her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. "My life would have been unbearably boring with someone else. You think I wanted simple? Clara, I spent 7 years drowning in simple. I wanted real, challenging, worth fighting for." He turned her to face him. "You made me better. Made me want to be better. Every single day I wake up grateful that you were brave enough to take my hand that first night. Grateful that you didn't let them destroy you. Grateful that I get to spend my life with the strongest person I've ever met." "I'm not that strong," Clara protested. "Half the time I'm terrified I'm going to fail, that I'll prove all of them right about me being unsuitable." Being terrified and doing it anyway, that's the definition of courage. Adrian kissed her forehead. "And you've never failed at anything that mattered. You survived childhood in a world that didn't want you. You faced down your worst enemies. You changed the entire social structure of English aristocracy. You're founding schools and influencing Parliament. What exactly would constitute failure?" Clara laughed despite herself. "When you put it that way, I suppose I've done all right." "You've done more than all right. You've done what I thought was impossible. You've made me believe the world can actually change, that people can be better if someone just shows them how." A knock came at the door. Emily entered, carrying a letter on a silver tray. "This just arrived for you, Your Grace. From America." Clara took the letter, curious. She'd been corresponding with several American educators, interested in establishing similar schools across the Atlantic, but she hadn't expected a response so quickly. She broke the seal and read, her eyes widening with each line. "What is it?" Adrian asked. "It's from a Thomas Gallaudet," Clara said slowly. "He's opening a school for the deaf in Connecticut, and he's asking if I would consider serving as a patron and advisor. He says my story has inspired similar movements in America, and they want to learn from what we're building here." She looked up at Adrian, stunned. "Our work is reaching across the ocean." Adrian smiled. "Of course it is. Truth tends to travel. And what you've proven? That different doesn't mean lesser, that accommodation isn't weakness, that society's rules can and should change. That's a truth people everywhere need to hear." Clara read the letter again, marveling at phrases like beacon of hope and revolutionary approach, and changing the conversation about disability and worth. "I was just trying to survive," she whispered. "You were just trying to survive," Adrian agreed, "and in doing so you showed everyone else how to thrive. That's the thing about courage, Clara. It's contagious. One person stands up, refuses to accept the world as it is, demands better, and suddenly others find the courage to do the same. Over the following months, Clara's influence continued to expand. She testified before Parliament about the need for educational reform. She hosted gatherings where mothers of deaf children could share resources and support. She wrote articles for progressive publications about reconsidering how society defined ability and worth. And everywhere she went, people stared, but not with pity anymore. With curiosity, respect, hope that if she could rewrite the rules for herself, maybe they could rewrite them too. The letters poured in from across England and beyond. Women who'd been hiding disabilities for years, suddenly brave enough to be visible. Parents refusing to institutionalize their different children, insisting they deserved education and opportunity. Young people questioning whether the social hierarchies they'd inherited were actually worth preserving. Clara had become something she'd never intended, a revolutionary. Not through violence or radical rhetoric, but through the simple act of refusing to be invisible. 1 year after the wedding, Clara stood in the same ballroom where Adrian had first asked her to dance. But tonight wasn't a ball. It was a fundraising gala for the Blackmore Foundation, which now supported 5 schools, 3 medical clinics, and numerous advocacy initiatives. The room was packed with faces Clara had come to know well over the past year. Duchess Eleanor, now chairwoman of the foundation's board, Dr. Morrison, who'd become their chief medical advisor, Emily, who'd been promoted to head of household staff and Clara's personal assistant, even Lady Margaret, who'd quietly donated a substantial sum and now volunteered teaching wealthy children about acceptance and inclusion. Adrian found Clara near the terrace doors and pulled her into a dance. They'd become famous for these moments, the Duke and Duchess moving together to music only one of them could hear, a perfect metaphor for partnership that didn't require sameness. As they turned across the floor, Adrian leaned close enough for Clara to read his lips. "I have news." "Good news or complicated news?" "Both." He smiled. "You're going to be a mother." Clara stopped moving, certain she'd misread. "What?" "You're pregnant, Clara. About 3 months, according to Dr. Morrison." The room seemed to tilt. Clara had been feeling unwell for weeks, but had attributed it to exhaustion from their busy schedule. A baby. She was going to have a baby. "Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. Adrian's expression transformed into something so tender it made her throat tight. "I'm terrified and ecstatic and already planning how to childproof Blackmore House. So yes, incredibly happy." He placed a hand over her still flat stomach. "This child is going to change everything. An heir to the duchy who might be deaf, might be hearing, might be something in between, and regardless of which, they're going to grow up in a world that's better than the one you did. A world where being different doesn't mean being less. Where accommodation is expected, not grudgingly given. Where worth is measured by character, not conformity." Clara felt tears streaming down her face. "What if I'm not a good mother? What if I can't—" "You'll be an extraordinary mother," Adrian interrupted, "because you understand what it means to feel invisible, and you'll make sure our child never does, because you know how to fight for what matters, and you'll teach them the same, because you survived and thrived despite everything working against you, and you'll give them a foundation you never had." He pulled her close. "Our child is going to be so loved, Clara, so seen, so certain of their worth. And if they face challenges, hearing loss or anything else, they'll have parents who know exactly how to support them, how to demand the world meet them where they are, instead of the other way around." Clara buried her face in Adrian's shoulder and let herself cry. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. She'd survived so much, had fought so hard, had transformed herself from the invisible girl at the wall into a duchess who changed laws and founded schools and gave hope to thousands. And now she was going to be a mother. The music swelled around them, a force Clara couldn't hear but could feel in every fiber of her being. In Adrian's arms, in the vibrations through the floor, in the way the assembled guests were watching them with expressions of joy and celebration. This was what victory looked like. Not a single moment of triumph, but a sustained transformation. Not just surviving, but thriving. Not just being seen, but using that visibility to ensure others were seen too. Clara pulled back to look at Adrian's face. "Thank you," she signed and spoke simultaneously. For what? For seeing me, when everyone else looked through me. For believing I was worth fighting for when I didn't believe it myself. For giving me permission to be exactly who I am. Adrian's eyes were suspiciously bright. You gave yourself permission, Clara. I just recognized what was already there. You would have found your strength eventually, with or without me. Maybe, Clara agreed, but I'm glad it was with you. They resumed dancing, and Clara let herself feel the full weight of everything she'd accomplished. The girl who'd spent her life apologizing for existing had become a woman who demanded the world apologize to her. The outcast who'd hidden in shadows had become a beacon lighting the way for others. The woman society had deemed unsuitable had proven that society's definition of suitable desperately needed updating. And the best part? This was just the beginning. Years would pass. Their child, a daughter named Eleanor Catherine, would be born hearing but would learn to sign before she could speak, growing up fluent in both worlds. 2 more children would follow, and all 3 would be raised to question rules, demand equity, and understand that worth wasn't granted by others, but claimed by oneself. The Blackmore Foundation would expand across Europe and into America, changing how entire countries educated and accommodated their deaf citizens. Clara's testimony before Parliament would lead to the Education Reform Act of 1818, mandating that all children, regardless of disability, receive appropriate education. And Clara herself would be remembered not just as a duchess, but as the woman who'd silenced the world's cruelty with the power of her own unshakable worth. But on this night, dancing in her husband's arms with their first child growing inside her, Clara didn't think about legacy or history or the grand sweep of change she was enacting. She thought about the little girl she'd been, standing against the wall at her first ball, invisible and convinced she deserved to be, believing the world when it told her she was broken, limited, less than, and she wished she could go back and tell that girl what she knew now. You're perfect exactly as you are. The world will try to make you small. Don't let it. Your silence is not weakness. It's power they fear because they can't control it. You will fall in love with a man who sees your strength. You will change laws and found schools and give hope to thousands. You will be remembered not for what you couldn't do, but for everything you accomplished anyway. You will survive. You will thrive. You will matter. And you will never, ever be invisible again. The music ended. The crowd applauded. Clara and Adrian stood in the center of the ballroom that had witnessed both her destruction and resurrection, and Clara felt something settle in her chest that she'd been seeking her entire life. Peace. Not because the world had stopped being cruel or challenging or difficult, but because she'd learned that her worth didn't depend on the world's approval. She was enough, had always been enough, and no amount of mockery or scandal or attempts at destruction could change that fundamental truth. Adrian leaned down to sign and whisper simultaneously, "I love you." Clara rose on her toes to kiss him, not caring about propriety or the watching crowd or anything beyond this moment. This man, this life they'd built together from the ashes of society's cruelty. When they finally pulled apart, she signed back, "I love you too, forever." And somewhere in that ballroom, among the aristocrats and reformers, and people whose lives Clara had touched, the little deaf girl who'd spent years convinced she didn't deserve love watched her future self and finally believed. She belonged. Not because the world had changed its mind about her, but because she'd changed her mind about herself. And that had made all the difference.